Snow howls over a Viking fjord village. The old gods want their Yule. A young priest wants his Christmas. And Eirik the shipbuilder mostly wants dry socks and fewer opinions from the sky. Settle in as one stubborn little village tries to survive one hard winter, two rival traditions, and a very dramatic Yule goat without tearing itself in half. Chapter 1. The Last Long Night. The fjord lay under a crust of ice that was just thick enough to be useless. It did not bear weight, it only complained. Every time Eirik stepped close to the shore he could hear it, a faint groan from the frozen surface, as if the fjord itself were tired of the season. He sympathized. His toes had gone past cold to that numb stage where they felt like someone else's toes, possibly belonging to a man who made better life choices than working on a ship hull in the sharp morning wind. The unfinished boat rested on wooden supports beside him, ribs bare, heavy timbers dark with frost. Snow clung to every edge. Eirik ran a hand along the curve of the keel and tried to imagine it gliding through soft summer water. At the moment that required more imagination than he currently possessed, he muttered to the sea that it had better appreciate all this effort in a few months. The sea, as usual, did not answer. The wind did, though, blowing a gust straight down the neck of his tunic and reminding him that he had forgotten to mend the loose stitching. He paused, leaned on his axe handle, and looked up the slope toward the village. Smoke rose from the longhouses in low grey lines, pressing against the pale winter sky. Somewhere up there the sensible part of his life existed. It included warmth and stew, and his wife's talent for turning chaos into lists. Down here was the other part, where the world was made of wood, ice, and limited daylight, and where problems did not respond well to lists. He judged the light with a squint. Not much left before the short day began its slide into early dusk. It was the last stretch before the long night of Midwinter, when the village would pretend to relax while actually worrying about everything. He lifted the axe again. One more beam to shape for the hull, he told himself. One more clean swing, maybe 10 or 20 times, and then he would go inside before his toes left his feet out of protest. The wood resisted at first, stiff with cold, then yielded. Each stroke rang in the quiet air. Tiny chips flew and landed in the snow, where they looked like little curls of summer trapped in winter's teeth. A shadow fell across the hull. Eirik turned and saw little Ragnar standing a few paces away, cloak too big, hat slipping over one eye, boots already collecting snow. Her breath puffed in small clouds as she watched him. "You are supposed to be helping your mother," he said without using his voice. It was amazing how much work he could do with just an eyebrow. Ragnar answered his unspoken commentary when of her own. She folded her arms and looked at the hull with great seriousness, the way she did whenever she tried to force the world to make sense. "Mother sent me to remind you," she said at last, "that the list is not getting shorter while you stare at wood." Eirik snorted softly. That does sound like something she would say. Ragnar stepped closer, peering at the timbers. "Is it true that if the boat is not finished before the long night ends, the sea will be offended and sulk until spring?" Eirik considered this. "No," he said. "The sea does not care about our schedules. That honor belongs to your mother. So the sea will forgive you," Ragnar said. "But mother might not exactly," Eirik said. "You understand the true forces that rule the world." He set the axe down, flexing his hands to get feeling back. "Tell her I will come in when the sun reaches the top of that ridge," he added, nodding toward the low hills. "Or when my toes fall off, whichever happens first." Ragnar studied the ridge, then his boots. She clearly doubted the fairness of this plan, but also knew better than to argue with both her father and the hills at the same time. She nodded, then scampered back up the path, leaving a neat line of boot prints in the snow. Eirik watched her go, then turned back to the hull. Another few strikes of the axe, another small cloud of chips. Work helped keep the cold away, or at least distracted him from it. The rhythm was familiar, as old as his hands. Yet under the rhythm was a restless feeling, a faint itch in his thoughts. The village had been murmuring more than usual. Traders had brought news of changes, and the air seemed full of question even when nobody spoke them aloud. He focused on the next cut, pretending he did not feel that itch at all. Inside the longhouse, the air was almost too warm after the shore. Eirik stepped in through the low doorway and felt heat and smoke wrap around him like another cloak. His toes tingled a warning as sensation tried to return. The central hearth glowed with a deep bed of coals and the lazy flicker of flames. Pots hung over it, sending up smells of dried fish, cabbage, and the stubborn hope that there would be enough for everyone. Along the walls, benches and chests lined the space, draped with furs and blankets. Shadows from roof beams and hanging tools made the interior feel like a carved wooden cave. At the far side, Solveig sat at the one table that could still be seen under all the clutter. She had a piece of charcoal in hand and several planks laid out in front of her, each covered in neat marks and notes. Eirik did not have to read the words to know they were planning lists. Arn and Ragnar were positioned at strategic distances from their mother, far enough to limit immediate conscription into chores, close enough to look useful if suddenly observed. "You are late," Solveig said calmly, without looking up. This was impressive, considering that from her angle she could not even see the door. "The sun disagreed with your schedule," Eirik answered, pulling off his gloves. "Also my toes filed a protest." "They can complain later," Solveig said. "Right now you must listen." Eirik considered saying that his ears were on strike as well, but he valued his marriage, so he held his tongue and came closer. Arne shifted aside to make room, his lanky frame all elbows and curiosity. On the nearest plank, Eirik could see lines dividing the surface into days, tasks and resources. Solveig had long ago given up on parchment for anything important. Wood did not tear and could be repurposed into kindling if a plan proved truly impossible. "Here," she said, tapping one row. "This is the Yule baking, this is the curing of meat, this is the preparation of decorations. And here is where we would plan any new Christian customs, if anyone bothered to tell me what those are." Her gaze slid toward Arne, who had carved a small cross into the edge of his belt, and was not very subtle about admiring it. "It is not my fault," Arne protested mildly. "Father Matthias is not here yet. I cannot ask him if he is still stuck in Nidaros." Ragnar shot him a sidelong glare. "We already have Yule. Why do we need another winter feast to make things more complicated?" Arne answered. "That is how adults entertain themselves." Eirik carefully did not laugh. Solveig did not bother restraining her sigh. "We need to know what to prepare," she said. "If the priest wants candles, we must dip them. If he wants special bread, we must bake it. If he wants to stand on something important while he speaks, we must find it and make sure it does not wobble. We could make him a little platform from the broken trough," Arning suggested. "Then if his words are boring and he moves too much, he will fall and we will all wake up." Ragnar frowned. "You cannot make the priest fall on purpose. The new god might notice." "The new god is supposed to be kind," Arne said. "He will probably forgive one small accident." Eirik looked down at his hands, rubbing a streak of sawdust between his fingers. He remembered the trader who had come to the village a few days earlier, telling stories in the smoky light of the evening. "A young priest is coming from Nidaros," the man had said, "sent by the king himself to show all of you proper Christmas worshants. He will have heavy books, serious opinions, and most likely very thin boots." The elders had grumbled. The younger folk had asked question. Eirik had mostly wondered if the priest would expect to be hosted in the best longhouse, and whether that longhouse had a roof that did not drip on guests. Now Solveig tapped another line on her planning plank. "We do not know which day exactly he will arrive," she said. "The trader said before the long night. That is not precise." "Traders never are," Eirik muttered. "If they were precise, they would have to be honest as well." Still, Solveig said, "We must plan. If he comes early, we feed him. If he comes late, we smile politely and hand him leftovers. Either way, the house must look like we always live in perfect order." Arn looked around at the crowded longhouse, where tools, drying herbs, half-mended clothing, and a suspiciously large pile of firewood competed for space. "So we must lie," he observed. "A little. We must present our best side, Solveig corrected, which in our case will require some searching. Ragnar hugged her knees, leaning closer to the fire. Will the priest make us stop lighting the Yule log and honouring the spirits in the woods? She asked. That depends, Eirik said, on what the king has told him, on how much courage he has, and on how much he enjoys eating alone. Solveig gave him a look that said he was not helping, but her mouth twitched at the corners. The children came first, always. Their fears mattered even when the adults were too tired to untangle all the reasons behind them. Eirik settled on the bench beside Ragnar, feeling the heat soak into his chilled legs. Listen, he said. The winter will come whether we light candles for Christ or for the old gods. The snow does not ask who we pray to. It only asks if we have enough firewood. And if we do not, Arne added, we freeze. That is a religion everyone understands. Solveig nodded. We will honour what our parents taught us, she said, and we will listen to what the priest says. We will decide what to keep. We are not children who need every rule given to us. Ragnar studied the fire as if trying to read its opinion in the flames. And if the gods argue, she asked softly, then they can argue among themselves, Eirik answered. As long as they leave our roof standing and our stew warm, they may have all the debates they like. Ragnar leaned against him, reassured by his steady voice more than by the actual logic. Arn fiddled with his carved cross, his thoughts already halfway to Nidaros. Solveig picked up her charcoal again. Her lists would grow longer. Eirik could see it in the firm set of her shoulders. He almost felt sorry for the priest, almost. The trader who had brought the news of the priest's approach returned that afternoon, just as the pale sun was beginning to slide behind distant hills. His small boat scraped against the rough pier, ice crunching around the hull. The man climbed out with the weary grace of fun who has fallen into cold water enough times to respect the possibility. Villagers gathered slowly, drawn by the change in rhythm. In winter any arrival was a small event. Children tumbled ahead, adults followed at a more careful pace. Eirik came down from the longhouse out of equal parts curiosity and duty. Solveig sent him with a fresh loaf of barley bread as a sign of hospitality and as a bribe for information. The trader's name was Halvard. He wore a cloak that had once been proud but now was mostly patches, and he had the satisfied look of someone who had survived bad weather and was ready to complain about it in detail. Eirik handed him the bread. In return, Halvard handed the gathered villagers an armful of news. The priest left Nidaros 2 days ago, he said through a mouthful of crust. He travels with 2 helpers and enough books to sink a small boat. They have a sled and a stubborn horse. They should reach the fjord road tonight if the wind does not throw them into a ditch. The elders exchanged glances. Torgrim, the village Godi, folded his arms over his broad chest. He had a beard like an offended snowdrift, and a voice that could silence a gathering with a single cleared throat. What does he want? Torgrim asked. Aside from our souls, and our time, and probably our better food. Halvard shrugged. To bring Christmas, he said lightly. To make sure the king's wishes reach even this corner of the world. To convince you that his god is stronger than your old ones, but in a polite way if possible. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the group. Tension thinned but did not disappear. Arn slipped to Eirik's side, eyes bright. Have you seen the church in Nidaros? He whispered. Is it as grand as they say? Halvard chewed, then nodded. It is big, he said, full of scaffolding and shouting. Stones everywhere. It will be grand when they are done. For now it is mostly very confident piles of rocks. Ragnar stayed close to Eirik, one hand gripping his sleeve. She did not ask anything, but her eyes were wide, taking in every word. Torgrim's gaze slid toward the line of houses. Our village already honours the turning of the year, he said. We light the Yule log, we pour ale to the spirits, we tell the old stories. Why must a stranger come and telleth the time? Because the king says so, Halvard replied. Also because the church wants you to stop watering the ground with ale that could be used for taxes. That drew louder laughter even from Eirik. Torgrim snorted, a sound that could have meant amusement or disgust, or both. The priest will need a place to stay, someone noted. Many heads turned almost in unison toward Eirik's longhouse. It was not the largest in the village, but it was solid, and Eirik had a reputation for being reasonable. Eirik lifted his hands. "My roof leaks near the north beam," he said. "If they want to interpret that as a sign from their god, they are welcome, but perhaps they would prefer a drier miracle." "Solveig will not be pleased if you turn away a guest," an older woman remarked. She had known Eirik since he was younger, and therefore felt no obligation to soften the truth. Eirik sighed. He could imagine the look Solveig would give him if he tried to dodge hosting duties. It was the look that could make a grown man feel like he had just spilled stew on the best cloak. "We can spare a corner," he said at last. "If the priest does not mind ducking his head at the door and sleeping under a roof that complains during storms." Halvard clapped him on the shoulder. "You are generous," he said. "I hope the priest appreciates it, or at least does not try to rearrange your furniture in the name of holiness." The villagers began to drift back toward their homes, carrying the news with them like a new draught of air. Some faces were wary, some curious, a few openly annoyed. Winter was already demanding enough. Adding theology to the list felt like an indulgence. Eirik stayed by the shore a moment longer, watching the ice shift. The sky had taken on that deep blue grey that meant night was coming fast. Somewhere beyond the hills, a priest and his helpers were making their way along frozen roads, following orders from a distant king. Soon they would step into the quiet drama of this small village. Eirik drew his cloak tighter. He hoped the man liked fish. There was going to be a great deal of fish in his immediate future. That night, by the hearth, the longhouse felt both safer and smaller. The children were quieter than usual. Even Arn had run out of question and was pretending not to imagine what the priest would look like. Solveig sat with her plans stacked neatly beside her. For once she was not adding new items. She stared into the fire instead, her hands resting in her lap. Eirik stretched his legs toward the warmth. His toes, after some negotiation, had decided to remain attached, and were now thawing in a series of sharp protests. He listened to the small sounds of the house, the crack of burning wood, the faint rattle of dried herbs overhead, the soft sigh of someone settling under a blanket. "So," he said at last, "we are to have Christmas this year, it seems. We already have Yule," Ragnar murmured. Her face was half buried in a fur, only her eyes visible. "Maybe we will have both," Arnie said. "Twice the candles, twice the songs, twice the bread." "Twice the work," Solveig added. But her tone was not harsh, she sounded more tired than anything else. Eirik watched the flames lick the edges of a log. When he had been Arne's age, winter had followed predictable patterns. The old stories ruled the nights. The gods were distant but understood. You knew who to thank, who to placate, which rituals to follow so that the world stayed more or less in working order. Now new stories were arriving, shoved in on sleds and strapped to the backs of priests. The king in Nidaros declared that they would all speak the same prayers. The church promised salvation, which sounded appealing on paper but came with a great deal of supervision. Eirik did not fear change itself. Boats changed, tools changed. You adapted or you sank. But faith touched everything. It reached into quiet moments like this, into the way children thought about stars and storms. He did not want that touched carelessly. "We will listen," he said aloud, more to himself than to anyone. "We will listen to what he says. We will weigh it against what we know. We will not be rushed." Solveig nodded slowly. "We will be courteous," she said. "The king may send priests, but he does not yet send extra food. We must still live with each other when the visitors go home." Arnie glanced at his carved cross. "Do you think the priest will be angry if he sees that I still carve runes?" he asked. Eirik considered. "I think," he said, "that if his god is strong, he will not be afraid of a few marks in wood. And if the priest is wise, he will understand that a boy who loves carving is a better student than one who loves nothing at all." Ragnar spoke so quietly that her words almost drowned in the crackling fire. "Will the sun still come back if we do things differently this year?" Eirik hesitated. Then he reached out and pulled her a little closer. "The sun has been returning since long before our stories," he said. "It is stubborn, like your mother, like this village. It will come back. Our confusion will not stop it." Ragnar let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Arm lay back against the bench, eyes half closed, his mind drifting somewhere between the longhouse and the imagined streets of Nidaros. Solveig leaned her shoulder against Eirik's. For a time they sat in silence, watching the coals settle into a dim glow. Outside, the wind prowled around the corners of the house, searching for weak joints and loose shutters. Inside, the warmth held. Eirik did a quick count of the problems lined up in front of them. A leaking roof, an unfinished ship, a priest descending on them with royal orders, a village full of people who had strong opinions and weaker patience. It could be worse, he thought. They had food, if not enough to be careless. They had wood stacked high. They had each other, which was a blessing and a trial in equal measure. He had survived other winters. He would survive this one too. He let his eyes close, listening to the lull of the fire. The last long night was almost upon them. Soon the celebrations would begin, the arguments would flare, the days would lengthen by slow, stubborn steps. For now he allowed himself one quiet wish, not for riches, not for victory, but for a winter in which no roof fell, no child was lost, and no argument tore the village in two. A simple wish, he thought, which meant the gods would probably consider it extravagant. Sleep took him gently, as the fire burned low and the longhouse breathed around him. Chapter 2. A Priest in the Snow. The storm arrived on the same day as the priest, which Eirik took as a sign that the gods, old or new, enjoyed practical jokes. Snow had been falling since dawn, steady and quiet. By midday the path down to the fjord had become a white tunnel between drifts, and the trees stood like silent spectator wrapped in frost. The wind insisted on rearranging every loose handful of snow into Eirik's face. He was at the shore again, because ships and storms did not consult each other on timing. He had just finished covering the unfinished hull with extra tarred cloth when he heard the shout. A figure came stumbling along the road from the east, bent against the wind, cloak flapping like a flag of poor judgment. Behind him followed a small horse dragging a sled, and behind that trudged two smaller figures, who moved with the stiff determination of people who regretted many choices. Eirik squinted through the blowing snow. The lead figure raised an arm in greeting. Then, as if the gesture had offended the ice, his boot skidded on a hidden patch and he went down in a slow, undignified slide that ended with him sitting directly in a snowbank. The horse stopped and regarded him with patient disapproval. Well, Eirik thought, the priest has arrived. He jogged up the path to meet them, boots crunching. By the time he reached the little caravan, the fallen man was struggling to his feet, his face an interesting combination of embarrassment and forced serenity. "I am perfectly all right," the stranger pronounced, in the tone of someone who believed that if he repeated it often enough the world would agree. One of the helpers, a woman with reddened cheeks and a shawl wrapped high, brushed snow off his shoulders with brisk efficiency. Eirik stopped a few paces away and bowed his head slightly. "Welcome to our village," he said. "You have chosen a dramatic day for travel." The man straightened, or tried to. Snow clung to his cloak and hat. His nose was red, his eyes watering from the wind, but beneath the frost he had the clear, earnest look of someone young enough to still find duty exciting. "I am Father Matthias," he said, "sent from Nidaros by the bishop, with letters from the king, and a sincere desire not to fall again in front of my new congregation." Eirik allowed half a smile. "The sea is behind you," he said. "That reduces your danger by half. I am Eirik, shipbuilder. The long house up the slope there is mine and my wife's. We are to host you." Matthias nodded gratefully. "That is most kind. I am told you have a dry house and a strong roof." Eirik briefly considered correcting this delicate misunderstanding, then decided to let hope have its brief moment. "We do have walls," he said. "They will keep the wind outside, which is more than the road has done for you." He gestured for them to follow. The horse snorted and shook its head as if agreeing that indoors sounded ideal. As they made their way up the path, villagers emerged from doorways and worksheds, drawn by the unusual sight. A priest in his long dark cloak, with the cross at his throat, looked almost like a shadow cut out of the sky and placed in the snow. The two helpers walked close behind. One was the woman Eirik had seen, carrying a heavy leather satchel that suggested books. The other was a young man with a narrow face, his arms full of bundled items that looked suspiciously like more books. Eirik resisted the urge to offer to carry something. If the king insisted on sending theology to his village, it could arrive under its own power. At the top of the path, Torgrim stood waiting, planted in the snow like an old tree that no one dared to cut. His cloak was fur-lined, his staff carved with runes. Around him, a small cluster of elders watched with varying degrees of openness. Father Matthias stopped in front of him and bowed his head. "Peace to this house and to this village," he said, voice carrying in the still air. "I come to bring you the joy of Christmas and the blessing of Christ." Torgrim regarded him with the calm interest it might give an unusual type of weather. "We already have Yule," he said. "It comes every year. No one had to drag it up the hill on a sled." A flicker of humour passed through Matthias's eyes. "Yule honours the turning of the year," he said. "Christmas honours the one who made the years. There is room for both understand and joy." Torgrim grunted. "We shall see," he said. "Joy is welcome, confusion less so." Eirik watched the exchange like the rest, feeling the tension of the moment stretch. The storm helped, oddly. It was hard to maintain lofty indignation when snow kept trying to crawl up your sleeves. Solveig appeared at Eirik's side, cheeks flushed from the cold and from the speed of her preparations. She inclined her head to Matthias with polite warmth. "You must be frozen," she said. "Come inside. We can argue about the nature of joy after you have eaten." This, Eirik thought, was why she ran the household and not the men with their staffs and crosses. She understood priorities. Matthias smiled, relief visible in the lines of his face. "That is very gracious," he said. "Food would be a blessing." Torgrim did not protest. Even a Godi could see that hospitality came before debate. The villagers parted, and the little group moved toward the longhouse. Arn and Ragnar watched from just inside the doorway, like two small scouts. Arn's eyes were fixed on the cross at Matthias's throat. Ragnar's gaze darted between the strangers and the storm, as if expecting the sky to show an opinion. The longhouse quickly filled with the rust of cloaks being removed, boots shuffled aside, and voices layered over each other. The priest's helpers introduced themselves as Ingrid and Thomas. They spoke with accents from farther south that laughed easily enough when their attempts to step over a sleepy dog failed. Eirik took Matthias's outer cloak and hung it on a peg near the door, noticing how thin the wool was in places. Nidaros, for all its stone and importance, clearly did not equip its priests for every reality of village weather. "You travel light for a man carrying the king's wishes," Eirik observed, nodding toward the satchels full of books. Matthias chuckled. "Thoughts weigh less than iron," he said, "until you bind them into books. Then they become very heavy indeed." They settled around the hearth. Solveig ladled fish stew into bowls with the air of a general distributing supplies during a siege. Everyone received enough to warm their hands. The room settled into that particular hush of people eating and assessing each other at the same time. Eirik sat near Matthias, so he could observe him without being obvious. The priest ate with good appetite, not the delicate picking Eirik had expected. When he tasted the stew, his shoulders relaxed in visible gratitude. "Your journey was difficult," Solveig said. "Every journey in this season is an exercise in faith," Matthias replied. "The road was icy, the wind unkind, but the villages along the way offered shelter, and now we are here, which is where we are meant to be." Torgrim sat further down the bench, close enough to join the conversation, far enough to maintain symbolic distance. He stirred his stew thoughtfully. "You say we are meant to have this Christmas," he said. "How do you know?" Matthias met his gaze calmly. "The king has commanded it," he said. "The church has prayed for it, and I believe that the same God who set the stars also cares about small fjord villages and the people who build ships in the snow." Eirik felt Torgrim's eyes flick toward him for a moment, then back to the priest. "A smooth answer," the old Godi said, "but stars and kings are far away. We know our own weather better than they do." Matthias nodded. "That is true. I cannot tell you how the wind will turn or when the ice will melt, I can only tell you what I have been taught. That there is one God, and that he came into the world as a child, that he grew up, walked dusty roads, spoke to poor fishermen, and gave them hope. At this, several heads turned. Fishermen paying attention to a god felt like a practical detail. Arnie leaned forward. Why fishermen, he asked. Why not warriors or nobles? Maybe because fishermen are easier to find, Tomaz murmured, then flushed when a few people chuckled. Matthias smiled. Perhaps because fishermen know how to be patient, he said. They know that they cannot force the sea to give them what they want. They understand dependence. Eirik thought of long hours on boats, lines cast into cold waters, waiting for something unseen to tug back. He could see the appeal of a god who understood that sort of work. Ragnar shifted closer to Solveig. What about the old gods? She asked, her small voice cutting through the adult conversation. If your god comes here, will they be angry? Several elders looked uneasy. Children had a direct way of asking the questions that everyone else wrapped in caution. Matthias's expression softened. I cannot say what the old gods think, he said gently. I know what I have learned, that my God asks us to love one another, to care for the weak, to forgive those who hurt us. If there are other powers in the world, I hope they are not offended by kindness. Torgrim's mouth twitched. Some might be, he said, but that is their problem. A wave of low laughter eased the tension. The wind howled outside for emphasis, reminding everyone that whatever gods ruled the skies, the storm had not passed yet. As the bowls emptied and the warmth seeped back into cold bones, the conversation turned to customs. Matthias asked how they celebrated Yule. Torgrim described the lighting of the log, the telling of sagas, the simple offerings to ensure luck in the year ahead. The children chimed in with corrections and side comments whenever an adult forgot some dramatic detail. In return, Matthias described Christmas in Nidaros. He spoke of the church full of candles, of hymns echoing off unfinished stone walls, of bread and wine blessed and shared. His voice grew soft as he spoke of the story at the centre of it. A child born in a stable, in the middle of a cold night, while most of the world slept. When he finished, the longhouse was quiet in a different way. Even the wind seemed to pause and listen. Ragnar considered all this, then said, That sounds like Yule with more singing and less ale. Matthias laughed, a bright, honest sound. That is not completely wrong, he admitted. Torgrim lifted his bowl in a small half-salute. If your Christmas wishes health, luck, and light in the dark, he said, then it is not so different from Yule. The question is which stories we tell while we wait for the sun. Maybe, Solveig said, we can tell more than one story, as long as the bread does not burn while we argue. This earned approving murmurs. Bread was a language everyone spoke without translation. Later, when most of the visitors had gone back to their own hearths, Matthias sat with Eirik and Solveig by the still glowing coals. The children were supposed to be asleep. They were in fact listening with the full attention of youth, lying under blankets near enough to hear every word. You have children, Matthias observed, his gaze resting briefly on Arn and Ragnar's bundled shapes. 2, Eirik said, a practical number of heirs and an impractical number of opinions. You speak like a father, Matthias said. How do they feel about the changes in the land? Eirik scratched his jaw. Arn is curious, he said. He carves crosses in the edges of things when he thinks I am not looking. He likes new ideas the way some boys like new knives. Ragnar worries, Solveig added quietly. She thinks if we change how we celebrate, the world might stop turning properly. That if we forget a single offering or misplace a story, something important will be offended. Matthias nodded slowly. Change is hardest on those who had just begun to feel sure of the world, he said. I remember that from my own childhood. Did you grow up Christian? Solveig asked. Half and half, Matthias replied, a faint smile touching his lips. My father followed the old ways, at least in public. My mother prayed to Christ when she thought no one listened. I learned both sets of stories. I chose the church later, when I saw how it cared for the sick and the poor. But I still remember my father's tales of Odin and Thor. Torgrim would not enjoy hearing that, Eirik thought. The idea that a priest might know the old saga felt at once strange and oddly natural. You do not hate the old gods, Eirik said. I do not worship them, Matthias answered, but I respect the people who did. They did the best they could with the light they had. Now I believe there is a brighter light. My work is to share it without blinding people on the way. Solveig studied him for a moment, then inclined her head. That is a gentler answer than I expected, she said. I fell into a snowbank in front of your entire village, Matthias pointed out. Pride does not thrive in such conditions. Eirik laughed quietly. That at least was true. When Matthias finally lay down on the sleeping platform they had cleared for him, the longhouse settled again. The storm still muttered around the roof beams, but the fire was steady, and the presence of another human breathing in the dark somehow made the night feel less large. Ragnar shifted closer to Eirik. Her eyes gleamed faintly in the low light. If the priest and Torgrim argue, she whispered, will they make the gods angry? They will make each other tired, Eirik said softly. As for the gods, they can handle arguments. They have survived people for a long time. Arn spoke from his blanket. Maybe the gods will hold their own meeting and decide that they do not care how we decorate the house, as long as we are kind. That would be a reasonable position, Eirik agreed. Unfortunately, gods are rarely as reasonable as children. Ragnar frowned. I do not want them to be angry with us, she said. Eirik reached over and touched her hair lightly. We will honor what we can, he said. Light candles, share food, help our neighbors. Any god who disapproves of that is welcome to come down and explain himself. I will lend him my tools if he wants to help fix the roof. Ragnar gave a tiny sleepy smile at the idea of a sulking god patching leaks. Arnin asked, Father, do you think there really was a child born far away who changed everything? Eirik hesitated. In the quiet he could hear Matthias stirring slightly, though the priest did not speak. I think, Eirik said slowly, that people tell stories when they hope for something. They tell stories of children who will grow up to make the world kinder. They tell stories of gods who walk among them so that the distance between heaven and earth does not feel so wide. Do you believe that particular story? Arne pressed. Eirik listened to the wind for a moment, to the creak of the timbers, to the slow, steady breathing of his family. I believe in this, he said at last, in keeping the fire burning, in making sure you both grow ebb, if the world allows it, in trying not to make things worse than they already are. If the story of that child helps people do those things, then I can respect it. Arnie seemed to consider this for a long time. That sounds like an almost yes, he said drowsily. It is a practical yes, Eirik replied. Sleep, he added, more gently. Tomorrow the work begins again. Yule does not prepare itself. Neither does Christmas, so it seems. The children quieted. The fire sank lower, its warmth stretching thin but still sufficient. Outside, the storm prowled and paced and finally began, very slowly, to tire. Eirik lay awake a little longer, watching the faint glow on the rafters. Under his roof now lay not only his family and their old stories, but also a priest from Nidaros with new words and a new way of looking at winter. He felt no sudden revelation, no bright light of understand, just the familiar weight of responsibility settling more firmly on his shoulders. Whatever name they gave to the feast, whatever words they spoke over bread and ale, he thought, it must not split the village. That would be too high a price for any story, however holy. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of sleep around him draw him in. Tomorrow he would help Matthias and Torgrim negotiate where the gods were supposed to sit during the celebration. He suspected this would be more complicated than arranging seats for relatives. For now, he allowed himself to drift, trusting the worn beams above and the embers below, and the stubborn, untidy love that held his household together. Chapter 3 Lists of the Living. Morning came late, as it always did in deep winter. The sky brightened grudgingly, as if it had been up too late the night before and resented being called back to work. Inside Eirik and Solveig's longhouse, the day started with the shuffle of feet on packed earth and the soft clatter of bowls. Smoke from the hearth curled upward, found the hole in the roof, and then changed its mind halfway through, lingering dust low enough to sting everyone's eyes. Solveig stood at the centre of it all, hands on her hips, hair tied back with a strip of cloth that had clearly seen better battles. On the table in front of her lay 3 long planks of wood. Across them she had written names, tasks, and a system that made sense to her and terrified everyone else. Eirik suspected that if the gods ever needed help organizing fate, they would eventually end up talking to his wife. Father Matthias sat on a bench near the fire, wrapped in a dry tunic now, his travel cloak hanging beside the others to steam gently. He held a cup of warm ale in both hands, as if reluctant to let go of any source of heat the village offered. Torgrim had arrived early, stomping snow from his boots, and bringing with him an air of ceremonial inconvenience. He now sat opposite Matthias, staff leaning against the wall, arms folded, face carved into a thoughtful scowl. Arn and Ragnar sat to the side through some miracle of self-control, not interrupting yet, eyes moving back and forth between adults like spectator at an important game. "All right," Solveig said, tapping the first plank with a finger. "Before we begin arguing about the shape of the world, we must decide who is responsible for the things that will definitely fall if no one holds them." Eirik suppressed a smile. This was her favourite part of life, where chaos could be forced into columns. On this plank she had written the essential tasks: bread, meat, ale, firewood, cleaning, decorations, sleeping space for guests who would definitely appear without warning, and the vague but heavy category simply labelled problems. "We have Yule," she went on, "which requires bread, ale, and a house that does not collapse. Now we also have Christmas, which appears to require bread, some sort of special prayer, candles, and a priest who does not collapse." Matthias coughed softly, either at the smoke or at being categorized as maintenance. "I will try to remain upright," he said. "It seems useful." Torgrim lifted his chin. "The Yule rites must be kept," he said. "The log must burn through the long night. The old songs must be sung. The children must hear the stories. The spirits must be remembered. That is not negotiable." Matthias nodded. "And I must hold a mass to honour the birth of Christ," he said, "with readings, prayers, and a blessing. That is also not negotiable." Solveig raised an eyebrow. "Good," she said. "Now that we know what cannot be moved, we can work around it, like building a ship around a rock. Eirik does that often enough." "Sometimes the rock is very helpful," Eirik said. He was not entirely sure if he meant himself. She pointed at another part of the board. "We do not have enough time or strength to prepare 2 completely separate feasts," she said. "So we will have one feast that does double-duted. It will be Yule and Christmas together. The bread will not know the difference." Torgrim frowned. "Bread is blessed differently in the rites," he said. Solveig did not flinch. "Then we will bless it twice," she replied. "If both sets of words are kind, the bread will not be offended." Matthias almost choked on his ale, trying not to laugh. Arn leaned toward Ragnar and whispered, "Bread is wiser than many people. It never argues about what it is called." Solveig tapped a second plank. This enlisted names: Torgrim, Eirik, Solveig, Matthias, Ingrid, Thomas, several elders, and a long line under the cheerful heading Children. "These are the hands we have," she said. "We will not borrow more from neighbouring farms unless an avalanche of blessings falls from the sky. I would not count on that." Eirik studied the list. His name appeared more often than he liked, connected to wood, repairs, carrying, and the charming catch-all tasks as needed. "Torgrim," Solveig said, "you will lead the lighting of the Yule log and the telling of the old tales. Matthias, you will lead your mass when the time comes. But the people are not 2 separate flocks. They are white herd of very stubborn goats. We must decide how to share them." Torgrim's beard twitched. "I am not used to sharing my flock with a man whose god disapproves of carved idols," he said. Matthias spread his hands. "I am not used to sharing my flock with a man who threatens to read their fortunes in goat bones," he replied. "Yet here we are." The 2 men regarded one another, testing how much sharpness the room could handle. The storm outside muttered against the walls, a reminder that there were worse things than theological discomfort. Eirik decided to help. "Think of it this way," he said. "The villagers have limited energy. If they run from wet ritual to another all night, they will be too tired to work the next day. Then no one eats. Hungry people make poor worshippers. The gods, old or new, will not enjoy that. Torgrim grunted. You speak sense, he admitted, as if it hurt slightly. Matthias nodded. Very well. Perhaps the Yule log and stories can come first, he suggested. They belong to the long dark of the night. Then, when the first pale light returns, we can hold the mass. A new story for a new light. Solveig was already scratching notes on the plank. That could work, she said. People will already be awake from Yule. We only need to keep them from drinking so much ale that they cannot stand for the mass. Torgrim made a face. Moderation in ale is the most difficult of your proposals. Arn raised a hand, then lowered it again, then raised it anyway. We children can help, he said. We can carry water, make sure the cups are not always full. People will stay more alert if they are worried about losing their cups to us. Solveig nodded approvingly. Good. I will put you and the other older children on cup supervision, she said. That is both useful and a punishment, so it suits you. Ragnar tugged at the edge of the plank. What about gifts, she asked. For the gods and for people. If we do not leave anything for the old ones, will they feel forgotten? Torgrim softened a fraction. The gods know this is a hard winter, he said. A small piece of bread, a little ale, a candle. These are enough if the heart behind them is sincere, Matthias added. And giving to each other matters as well, to the children, to the poor, to anyone alone. That's one of the ways my faith honours God, by caring for those who have less. Solveig's charcoal moved faster. So, she said, we will have a shared table. On it we will place the Yule offerings and the Christmas bread. We will not argue over whose blessing reaches which piece. We will let generosity do the work. She looked up, meeting both men's eyes. Can either of your gods look at that and say it is wrong? Torgrim considered. If the old gods are displeased by people sharing food and keeping promises, he said, perhaps they need a long rest. Matthias smiled, the expression tired but genuine. My God would approve, he said. He likes tables where everyone gets to sit. Solveig nodded sharply, decision made. Good, then the gods can adjust. We do not have time to rebuild the entire winter for them. Eirik leaned back slightly, watching her with quiet admiration. He had seen warriors broker truces between rival chiefs that looked more fragile than the arrangement his wife had just carved into wood. Of course, he thought, now we only have to make it actually happen. The question of gifts turned out to be more complicated than the question of gods, which said something about human priorities. In the afternoon, Solveig summoned the children of the village to the longhouse. They arrived in clusters, wrapped in cloaks and curiosity, breath steaming as they stomped snow from their boots. Some were already at the age where they pretended to be more interested in practical matters than in gifts. Others still considered the entire season a legitimate excuse for wild hope. Eirik watched from a bench as Solveig stood in front of them like a commander addressing a very small, very fidgety army. Listen, she said. This year we have Yule and Christmas together. That means we must be clever about gifts. We have limited cloth, limited wood, and very limited patience. We will not waste any of them. A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the crowd. Ragnar sat near the front, hands folded, trying not to look like she wanted to ask 16 questions at once. Arnon sat by the wall, carving a small piece of wood with his knife, the movements neat and controlled. He looked up often, though, following every word. In the old way, Solveig went on, we give small offerings to the gods and small gifts to each other. In this new way we are also asked to give to those in need, in the name of the Christ child. That is fine. We have always helped each other, we simply did not have a special word for it. One of the older boys, Cole, raised a hand. If we give away too much, he said, what happens when we are in need? Then you will hope that your neighbours remember how generous you were, Solveig replied. If they do not, you have my permission to remind them firmly. The children grinned. This sounded practical enough. We will not be buying expensive things from Nidaros this year, Solveig continued. You will make gifts, small ones, useful ones, and you will help with the offerings. Arna glanced down at his carving. He had already made 2 small crosses and a rune stick with a luck charm. Now he began to see where they might go. She pointed toward a corner where several baskets had been placed. "In these we will collect simple items," she said. "Warm mittens that no longer fit you but can fit a neighbour. Bits of cloth that can patch a cloak. Carved toys. Story sticks. You will think carefully about what you can give without freezing or going hungry yourselves." Ragnar raised her hand. "What is a story stick?" she asked. Eirik answered this one. "A piece of wood with marks on it that help you remember a story," he said. "Not words, just shapes. You hold it while someone tells the tale, and when you see the marks again later, it brings the story back to you." Ragnar's eyes lit with delight. "That sounded like having a small secret map in your hand." "So," Solvik said, "one basket is for offerings to the old gods and the spirits. We will burn or bury or pour those as we always have, modestly, with respect. Another basket is for gifts to the poor and to each other in the new fashion. And a third is for children from the far farms who cannot come often. We will send them something with the traders when the roads are better." A small girl in the first row whispered, "Is this so both gods see that we are not selfish?" Solvik softened. "It is so all people see it," she said. "If the gods are watching, they are welcome to approve." The children began to buzz with ideas. Carved animals, simple dolls made from scraps, braided cords, polished stones. For all the talk of gods and kings, it was these small plans that gave the day texture. Arn moved next to Ragnar and held out the carving from his hands. It was a small disc, not yet finished. "See," he said, "I will carve a cross on one side and a simple protection rune on the other. That way whoever wears it can decide which way to turn it depending on who is visiting." Ragnar giggled. "Is that allowed?" she asked. "It is not forbidden," Arn said, "and if no one tells the gods, they will not know." Eirik shook his head fondly. It was not exactly the theology Father Matthias would approve, but as a practical approach to living through change, it had merits. In the back of the room, Torgrim and Matthias watched as well. The old goddy's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. The priest's face held that complicated expression of amusement, concern, and hope that Eirik was beginning to recognize as his resting state. "You see," Torgrim murmured, "the children are already weaving old and new together." Matthias sighed gently. "My teachers in Nidaros would insist that mixing symbols leads to confusion," he said. "But then, my teachers do not have to face your winter. I suspect the Lord can survive a shared pendant." Torgrim grunted in a way that suggested agreement. They both fell silent as the children surged toward the baskets, each beginning to sort through their meager hordes of treasures. The noise rose, but it was the good kind of noise, full of life and arguments about whose carving looked most like a goat. By late afternoon, the practical matter of the feast itself came crashing back onto the table, as if it had been patiently waiting while people dreamt of gifts. Ingrid and Tomas joined Solvig, Eirik, and a few elders at the planning plank. They had removed their travel weariness with a good meal and some rest, which left them free to worry properly about logistics. "We must account for the number of mouths," Ingrid said, pushing a lock of hair behind her ear with the back of her wrist. "We came through 3 villages that had less grain than you. The harvest was thin everywhere this year." Solvig nodded. "Our stores are not as large as we would like," she said. "But we've dried fish, a bit of smoked meat, some barley, and a few precious sacks of flour. We can stretch them if we are careful." Eirik pictured the storage pit behind the house, the barrels and sacks arranged like the ribs of that unfinished ship. He had been counting them in his mind all season, measuring risk against snow depth. "We will thin the stew," he said. "More water, more herbs, a little less meat in each bowl. No one will be full enough to sing loudly, but they will not faint either." Torgrim frowned. "The gods are used to better offerings than watered stew," he said. "Then the gods can share the good pieces," Eirik replied. "Human stomachs are more fragile than divine dignity." Matthias added, "The Christmas Mass does not demand rich food. A simple loaf of good bread is enough for the prayers. The rest is celebration, not requirement." Solveig grimaced slightly. "Good bread we can do," she said, "if vague relatives and lost cousins do not appear at the door in great numbers." "They will," Eirik said. You know they always hear when we have extra candles. In the end, they settled on a compromise feast. One main table in the longhouse, extended with borrowed boards and supported by whatever crates and barrels could be persuaded to stand still. Shared platters of fish and bread, a small portion of smoked meat, sliced thin but arranged so cleverly no one could tell how little there was. Bowls of soup and stew where the vegetables pretended to be more numerous than they truly were. Candles would mark the centre, some in simple holders carved with old symbols, one near a wooden cross that Thomas volunteered to make from the smoothest scrap he could find. Torgrim declared that the Yule blessings would be spoken when the first candles were lit and the Yule log placed in the hearth. Matthias agreed that he would speak his Christmas prayers when the first pale light of morning crept through the roof hole, bread raised in his hands. No one said that the arrangement felt like a negotiation between distant powers. It felt more like two sets of grandparents learning to share grandchildren during a winter visit. Eirik sat quietly at the edge of all this, trying to see where the cracks might appear. He could see so many possibilities. Someone drunk enough to shout an insult at the wrong time, a careless gesture that looked like disrespect, a piece of bread handed to the wrong person at the wrong moment. He also saw the tired lines on Solveig's face, the determined set of Matthias's jaw, the weight in Torgrim's eyes that had little to do with age. They are all trying, he thought. That was something. In a world where winter itself often felt like an enemy, any effort to make peace should count as a victory, however small. That night, when the last visitor left and the longhouse settled into its familiar breathing, Eirik's mind did not settle with it. He lay awake near the fire, listening to the occasional pop of sap in the logs, the faint whistle of wind through a tiny gap in the wall, the soft exhale of his children's sleep. In the dim light he could see Solveig's planning planks leaned against the far wall. The marks on them looked like runes of another kind, rows of obligations instead of prophecies. He started his private tally, the one he never spoke aloud. Roof beams, mostly sound, one still worrying him near the north corner. Firewood, high but not as high as he liked. Dried fish, enough if they did not get greedy. Grain, thin. Salt, just enough. Tempers currently under control but likely to fray the closer they came to the long night. Now, on top of all that, rituals and expectations. If the feast went well, the village would step into the rest of winter with something like confidence. If it went poorly, if someone felt insulted or forgotten, if Matthias wrote a report to Nidaros filled with complaints, if Torgrim decided his authority had been undermined, the aftershocks could ripple through the next season. He thought about Arne, eyes bright whenever Matthias spoke of distant lands and of the small carved cross that now shared space with older charms. He thought about Ragnar, clutching her blanket whenever anyone mentioned offended gods. He did not care which set of divine stories ended up winning the longer argument, as long as his children kept their sense of safety and their ability to laugh. Solveig shifted beside him, as if sensing the shape of his thoughts even in sleep. He reached over and rested a hand lightly on her arm, taking some of his worry and pressing it there, trusting that she could help shape it into something useful. We will get through this, he told himself. We always do. The snow comes, the snow melts. People complain, people adapt. The gods, in whatever form, either help or they stay silent. The work goes on. The fire crackled softly. The storm outside had eased a little, as if even the wind had appointments elsewhere. Eirik closed his eyes and forced himself to stop counting problems. If he started listing blessings as well, he might find that they matched. A wife who made lists instead of threats, children who cared enough to worry about the world, a village that, for all its friction, still showed up when a neighbour's roof sagged. He let that thought be the last before sleep. Chapter 4: The Goat, the Boar, and the Bread. 2 days later the village awoke to a minor disaster involving horns and pride. The Yule goat costume had vanished. Eirik heard the news before he had even properly sat up. A small boy burst into the longhouse breathless, snow in his hair, boots leaving melting prints on the packed earth. "The goat is gone," he announced. "Someone stole it." Solveig closed her eyes briefly, as if asking the universe for patience before breakfast. Eirik sat up, feeling joints protest, and looked at the boy. Slowly, he said. "Which goat?" "The costume," the boy said. "The big goat, the one Torgrim always wears when he knocks on doors and pretends to scare us." "Ah," Eirik thought, "that goat." Ragnar's head popped out from under her blanket. She adored the Yule goat, even while pretending not to be startled when it banged on the door and demanded to know if the children had behaved. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Maybe Torgrim hid it." The boy shook his head with the exaggerated drama of youth. "He says someone took it from the storage shed. He is very unhappy." That last detail was both unsurprising and concerning. An unhappy Torgrim before the long night was like a badly tied knot in a ship's rigging. It might hold, but you did not want to test it in high winds. Eirik pulled on his tunic and boots while Solveig muttered about timing and the mysterious hatred the gods seemed to hold for smooth schedules. Together they followed the boy to the small shed near Torgrim's house, where the costume had spent most of the year pretending to be a pile of old cloth and straw. A small crowd had gathered, because in winter the entertainment options were limited. Torgrim stood in front of the open shed, arms crossed, face carved into stone. Inside, on the floor, lay a few loose scraps of cloth and a sad tuft of straw. "It is gone," he said, with the gravity of someone announcing the loss of a ship. "Stolen or destroyed. Either way, the Yule goat cannot appear." Several of the older villagers shifted uneasily. The goat was more than a costume. It was a tradition, a familiar bit of mischief that helped bridge the gap between fear of the dark and laughter at it. Children waited for the knock on the door, the deep voice, the harmless scolding. Adults, secretly, waited too. Eirik studied the floor of the shed. There were tracks in the snow that suggested small boots, not large ones. The scraps of cloth were torn in a way that said more about enthusiasm than malice. "This looks like children," he said. "Bored children with ideas." Torgrim snorted. "Yule is not a game," he said. "The goat costume was made by my grandfather. It survived winters far harsher than this one. It will not be replaced in a few hurried hours." Solveig's gaze swept the onlookers. Several children avoided her eyes with suspicious care. Ragnar was not among them. She watched, anxious, but her expression held genuine confusion. Arn, however, shifted his weight with the guilty grace of someone who knew more than he planned to say. Eirik caught the movement. "Arn," he said mildly, "anything you would like to tell us?" Arn looked at the shed, at Torgrim's face, at his father, and sighed. "Not really," he said, which of course meant yes. Solveig folded her arms. "Try again," she suggested. Arn's shoulders slumped in surrender. "Some of us wanted the goat to have more presence this year," he admitted. "The horns kept slipping and the straw was falling out at the tail, so we thought we could improve it." "Improve," Torgrim repeated, in the slow voice of someone trying the word for the first time and finding it suspicious. Arn hurried on. "We took it apart," he said, "to fix it. But then the storm came again, and we could not work outside, and Ragnar said the spirits would be angry if we changed it too much. And then we argued, and then someone used part of it as a blanket for the neighbour's dog." Eirik pinched the bridge of his nose. "So at this moment," he said, choosing his words carefully, "the Yule goat is not missing so much as scattered." Several children winced in agreement. Torgrim closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, the anger in them tempered by something else. Weariness, perhaps, or the faint memory of having been a foolish child himself. "The goat must appear," he said. "It is part of the turning of the year. Without it, the children will feel the season is broken." Arne took a breath. "We can build a new one," he said. "I can carve a proper head from wood. Ragnar can help with the design. We have straw and cloth. It will not be the same, but it can be ready before the long night." Several of the younger children nodded vigorously, eager to redeem themselves or at least to be trusted with tools. Torgrim looked at them. For a moment his stern face softened, the lines of age and authority relaxing into something gentler. "The old goat costume would not last forever," he admitted. "My grandfather would say that if it cannot survive children, it was not strong enough to serve the gods. Very well, you will build a new goat, but it must be sturdy and worthy." He fixed Arn with a look. "And you will lead the work. You helped scatter it, you will gather it again in another form." Arn straightened, both daunted and proud. "Yes," he said, "I will." Eirik felt a flicker of relief. A disaster had been promoted to a project. In village life, that counted as progress. The boar problem came next. While Arn and the other children began their frantic construction in a side yard, Eirik joined a group of men at the pens near the edge of the village. The Yule boar, a plump creature with impressive tusks and a calm eye, stood in his enclosure and refused to walk anywhere. He was supposed to be led ceremonially through the village before the feast, to show that there was meat enough to share, even if in truth there was less than advertised. But the boar had developed a deep philosophical commitment to staying exactly where he was. "We could try pulling harder," Man suggested, already red in the face from earlier attempt. "Or," Eirik said, "we can accept that Noah wins arguments with a creature that weighs more than 3 men and has a better centre of gravity." The boar snorted, as if to agree. Torgrim arrived, drawn by the growing commotion. He took in the scene and frowned. "The boar must be shown," he declared. "It is part of the rite." "The boar must also want to walk," Eirik replied. "Otherwise the rite will include someone being stepped on." Matthias wandered up a moment later, wrapped in his cloak, curiosity pulling him into yet another set of village complications. "Problem?" he asked. "Traditional pig," Eirik said. "Modern attitude." The priest eyed the boar. "Does your rite demand that the animal be paraded?" he asked. "Or does it only demand that it be honoured and shared?" Torgrim hesitated. "In truth, in the first stories the boar was offered and its bones used for oaths," he said. "The parade came later, when people decided they liked the idea of showing off how much meat they had." Matthias gestured toward the animal, which blinked slowly, entirely at peace with its refusal. "Then perhaps," he said, "this year we focus on the honouring and the sharing. The boar clearly feels no need to be admired." Eirik rubbed his chin. "We could decorate the pen," he suggested. "Candles on the fence, a small wreath over the gate. People can come to the boar instead of the boar trudging through the snow for their entertainment." The boar snorted again, apparently encouraged by this new theology of staying put. Torgrim considered. It went against habit, but not against the heart of the tradition. "Very well," he said. "We will bless the boar where he stands. We will speak the oaths with a hoof instead of a bone for once. If the gods are offended by a practical pig, they may explain their priorities in person." Matthias smiled faintly. "I can also offer a blessing over the animal," he said, "thanking God for the food, asking that it strengthen us for the winter, if you do not mind." Torgrim sniffed, then shrugged. "If your god enjoys boar, he is welcome," he said. "We will see if the taste is improved." The men laughed. The tension broke. Together they decorated the pen with evergreen branches and a few scraps of red cloth. The boar watched them with placid interest, clearly willing to participate in any ritual that involved staying warm and occasionally being praised. Eirik, as he wound a bit of greenery around the fence, thought again that most of their troubles could be solved by asking the simple question Matthias had voiced. What is truly required, he thought, and what is just habit we are afraid to let go? It was the kind of question that could be uncomfortable, but it also opened paths through problems that had looked solid as stone. Back in the longhouse, the bread staged a rebellion of its own. Solveig had finally cleared a morning for serious baking. The hearth was hotter than usual, the coals spread wide, the flat oven stones properly heated. Bowls of dough rested under cloths, rising slowly according to the mysterious laws of yeast and patience. The air was thick with the warm, yeasty smell that made even full stomachs curious again. Ragnar guarded the bowls like a fierce little spirit, chasing away anyone who came too close with dusty hands and too much enthusiasm. "If the dough falls," she warned Cole, "we will have flat bread, and flat bread means flat spirits." Cole backed away, hands raised. Solveig moved between table and hearth, fingers flour-dusted, brow furrowed in concentration. She had carefully divided the dough into 3 purposes. One portion would become the simple loaves for daily eating. Another would be shaped into small festive breads for the Yule feast, with bits of dried fruit carefully hoarded through the autumn. The third, made with the finest flour they had, would be reserved for the Christmas Mass, scored with a small cross on top. She was in the middle of placing the first loaves into the oven when a neighbour burst in through the door. "Solveig," he called, forgetting every rule about entering a home calmly. "The roof beam over my storage pit is sagging. If it breaks, I will lose half my grain." Solveig closed her eyes for a heartbeat. The timing was, of course, excellent. Eirik was already rising. "I will come," he said, grabbing his coat. Torgrim, who happened to be there discussing some detail of the log, moved to follow. A sagging roof threatened more than grain, it threatened neighbours, which meant it was everyone's concern. Solveig looked from the open door to the bread in the oven. The loaves were not finished yet, they needed turning and careful watching. If she left, they might burn. If she stayed, a family's winter food might be ruined. "Go," Eirik told her. "You know beams better than I do." She hesitated, then nodded sharply. "Ragnar," she said. "The loaves need to come out when the tops are just starting to darken. Not black. Deep gold. You have seen it enough." Ragnar straightened, eyes wide. "Me?" she asked. "You," Solveig said. "Trust yourself. And do not get your sleeve in the fire." Then she was out the door, wrapped in her cloak, already talking about braces and spare posts as she followed the neighbour. The longhouse felt strangely quiet in her wake. Ragnar swallowed and moved to the hearth. The heat pricked her cheeks. She peered into the oven space, watching the pale tops of the loaves slowly deepen in colour. "This is fine," she told herself. "It is just bread. Mother does it all the time." Arne sat nearby, whittling another small charm. "You have seen her do this 100 times, he said. "You know the colour." Ragnar nodded, though her stomach fluttered. She tried to imagine Solveig's hands, sure and quick, reaching into the heat with the wooden paddle, turning the loaves, judging with eye and nose. Minutes stretched, the tops darkened. Not enough. Then a little more. Still not enough. Then suddenly the line between almost done and nearly burning seemed to loom like an unseen cliff. Now, she decided, because not deciding was worse. She slid the paddle under the first loaf, muscles tense, lifted and brought it out. A wave of heat washed over her. The crust looked good, a little darker at the edge than she would have preferred, but not ruined. She set it on the board and reached for the next. By the time the last loaf came out, her face felt as if she had been standing inside the fire. Arne leaned closer, examining them. "They look fine," he said. "Some people like their crusts bold." Ragnar sagged with relief, then straightened again as if someone might be watching. She arranged the loaves in neat rows, separating the plain from the festive from the special. Solveig returned not long after, cheeks whipped by the wind but eyes sharp. She scanned the oven, saw the empty space, saw the loaves. "Good," she said simply. "You pulled them at the right moment." Ragnar glowed so fiercely she might have lit the room without the fire. One loaf, slightly darker at one corner, caught Solveig's eye. She picked it up, broke off the overdone piece and tasted it. "Even the gods must eat slightly burnt bread sometimes," she said. "It reminds them that life is not perfect." Matthias, who had just stepped inside, overheard and smiled. "In Nidaros," he said, "the bread at the altar is always very fine. But once, one of the brothers burned it by mistake. We used it anyway. God did not complain. Or if he did, he was very polite about it." Torgrim snorted. "If the gods stop listening over a small patch of burnt crust," he said, "they can go find more grateful people." They shared a brief laugh, the kind that releases tension without needing explanations. The bread disaster, such as it was, had been avoided. A new confidence settled over Ragnar. She had helped bring something safely through fire. In a winter like this, that felt important. By the time evening wrapped itself around the village, preparations had turned into something like a rehearsal. The new Yule goat costume stood near the far wall, propped on a frame so everyone could admire or criticize it. Arne had kept his promise. The head, carved from a solid block of wood, had strong lines and a slightly mischievous tilt. The horns were sturdy and not likely to fall off even if the wearer decided to jump. The body had been rebuilt with fresh straw and patched cloth. It looked less ragged than the old costume but retained enough of its rough charm to feel familiar. Several of the younger children circled it with the awe one might give a visiting hero. Torgrim inspected it thoroughly, prodding seams, lifting edges, testing the weight. "It will do," he said at last. "The spirit of the goat will not be shamed." Arna relaxed, relief visible in his shoulders. Eirik watched the scene from beside the hearth, where the first of the festive breads were cooling. He felt something loosen in his chest. Traditions had been bent but not broken. The children had learned that they could repair what they damaged. The world had not ended. Father Matthias sat nearby, sipping warm ale with a grateful expression. He had spent part of the day helping Thomas carve a simple wooden cross for the feast table, sanding it until it felt smooth under his fingers. "You have good wood here," he said to Eirik. "It works well under the knife." "The trees are stubborn," Eirik replied. "They match the people." Matthias smiled. "A good combination for winter, not always good for bishops." The longhouse gradually filled with more villagers, drawn by the promise of a practice run. Solveig had decided that a rehearsal for joy was better than leaving everything to chance. "We will not do the full rites," she had explained. "We will simply test whether the benches collapse when everyone sits at once, whether the goat can fit through the door, and whether anyone starts fighting before the ale even warms their stomachs." So they did. People took their places on the benches. The new goat costume, worn by Torgrim himself, made its way through the doorway with minor difficulty and major applause. Children shrieked and pretended to hide, then immediately followed, tugging at the straw tail. Matthias tried a short prayer of blessing in the mixed company. Torgrim responded with a brief old blessing of his own, more habit than challenge. The two stood side by side near the hearth, their words rising together like smoke. No one burst into flames, no voices from the sky boomed objection. The only disturbance was a dog who decided that the goat's leg looked interesting and had to be gently encouraged to admire from a distance. When the pretend feast ended, with people returning bowls and cups and realizing the real feast would have slightly less stew and slightly more responsibility, there was a sense of quiet accomplishment. "We almost did it," Ragnar whispered to Arn. "It feels like a real celebration already." "Almost," Arn agreed. "Next time we add more candles and less panic." Eirik stood at the doorway as people left, watching them step into the crisp night. The sky was clear for once, stars sewn thickly across it. The breath of the village rose in small clouds, like offerings the wind could not quite steal. Tomorrow and the next day would bring new problems, he knew. They always did: snowdrifts, loose beams, sick goats, offended relatives. And, of course, the delicate dance between Yule and Christmas, between Torgrim and Matthias. But tonight, after a day of scattered goats, stubborn boars, and almost burnt bread, things felt less fragile. He closed the door, shutting out the cold. The fire behind him sighed and settled. The new goat costume loomed in the corner, waiting to walk again. The loaves on the table smelled warm and sure. For the first time, Eirik allowed himself to think that this strange Viking Christmas might actually hold together. Chapter 5. Snow over Nidaros. The day Eirik and Arne set out for Nidaros, the cold felt sharp enough to carve stone. They left before the pale light had fully admitted it was morning. The village still half slept, smoke drifting from roof holes in lazy ribbons. The sled waited at the edge of the path, runners already dusted with a thin skin of frost. The small horse shook its head as if offended at being asked to move before breakfast. Solveig tightened the strap on a bundle and stepped back, checking everything with a commander's eye. Dried fish for trade, a little wool, a few small carvings wrapped in cloth. Enough to justify the journey, not enough to be a disaster if something went wrong. "Remember," she said to Eirik, "if you see decent cloth at a fair price, buy some. And salt. And if they have that fine flour Matthias talked about. But do not trade away the spare axe head unless someone offers you an entire house in exchange." Eirik nodded solemnly. "Cloth, salt, flour. Keep the axe," he said, "and do not let Arnie swap himself for a book." Arn made a face. "I am worth at least 2 books," he said, "maybe 3. Ragnar stood close to Solveig, clutching the edge of her mother's cloak. Her eyes were already shiny with the effort of not crying. Goodbyes always looked shorter from the leaving side. How long will you be gone? She asked. Eirik considered. 2 nights if the road is kind, he said. 3 if it is its usual self. We will be back before the long night. The Yule goat still needs someone to trip over its hooves. Ragnar sniffed a laugh. Bring back something from the city, she said. A story at least. Stories are the cheapest thing in Nidaros, Eirik replied. I will bring you a sackful. Matthias approached from the longhouse, cloak wrapped tight. He looked less like a frozen shadow than when he had arrived, but still not entirely adapted to the village cold. You will go straight to the lower market when you arrive, he said. Ask for a man named Hakon, who sells candles and carved things. Tell him I sent you. He will know which merchants are honest and which ones only pretend. So all of them, Eirik said dryly. Matthias smiled. He will at least warn you about the ones who are especially ambitious. Torgrim was there as well, hands folded on his staff. Do not let the city swallow your sense, he told Arn. The stones there are new and proud. They forget they sit on old ground. Arn nodded, trying to look as if he already knew all about proud stones. The horse shifted impatiently. The sky was clearing into a pale, fragile blue. The road to Nidaros was not long in summer, but in winter every step became an argument with ice and snow. Eirik climbed onto the sled, taking the front. Arn scrambled onto the back, feet braced against a crate, eyes already turned toward the road. See, Eirik told him quietly as the horse leaned into the harness. If you want to know how the world is changing, you go to the city. If you want to know what keeps it standing, you look back at the village. Arn glanced over his shoulder. The long houses looked smaller from this angle, arranged along the curve of the fjord like a handful of wooden shells. Smoke rose, joining the cold air in soft threads. I will look both ways, he said. Good, Eirik replied. That is how you avoid walking into trees. The sled slid forward, runners whining softly on the packed snow. Voices called farewells that the wind picked up and carried away. Ragnar lifted a hand, then tucked it tightly back into her sleeve as the cold bit her fingers. Solveig watched until the sled disappeared between the trees, then turned back to the longhouse. There were lists to update and fires to tend and a priest, who still did not understand how to stack wood so it did not collapse. The road wound along the edge of the fjord, sometimes close enough that Eirik could hear the low groan of ice, sometimes climbing into the trees where the world narrowed to trunks and snow, and the round breathing of the horse. Arn asked questions at first about how many times Eirik had been to Nidaros, about what the unfinished church looked like, about whether the king truly walked among the workers or left all the shouting to others. Eirik answered as best he could, adding dry commentary where necessary. Then the rhythm of travel settled in. The runners hissed, the harness creaked, the breath of man and beast rose in steady clouds. The forest stood around them like a silent congregation, tall and unmoved. At that point, when the path levelled out and the horse found an easier stride, Eirik pointed to a faint line in the distance. There, he said. That ridge marks where the land begins to belong more to the city than to the farms. You cannot see the walls yet, but you can feel the pull. Arn tilted his head, as if listening for some new note in the air. It feels like when the tide turns, he said, only slower and colder. Eirik grunted in agreement. The tide of stone, perhaps. They stopped once to rest the horse and eat a little bread. Arn stamped his feet, shaking out the numbness. He looked along the road, then back the way they had come. Do you think the king knows the name of our village? He asked. Eirik considered. I think the king knows the names of important chiefs and large ships, he said. Small villages are numbers on a list to him. Grain owed, men promised. Arn frowned. That seems wrong. It is not personal, Eirik said. Kings cannot know everything. The village knows our names. That is enough. They set off again. By the time the light began to fade, the trees thinned and the road widened. More tracks marked the snow, sled marks and hoof prints, and the occasional confusing pattern that suggested someone had fallen and argued with gravity. The air changed. It carried more smoke, the sharper tang of many fires. The faint clang of metal came from somewhere ahead, and voices merged into a distant, busy murmur. Nidaros. Eirik said. "Welcome to the place where everyone is right and no one listens." Arn stood on the sled runners to see better as the city grew out of the winter light. The first sight of Nidaros always felt strange, like walking into someone else's story. Wooden houses crowded along the river, their roofs a jumble of lines under the snow. Smoke rose in heavy columns smudging the sky. Narrow streets twisted between the buildings, already half churned to slush by many feet. Above it all, on a slight rise, the church rose like a stubborn promise. It was not finished. Not yet. Scaffolding clung to its sides like a wooden skeleton around stone flesh. Walls of pale rock reached toward the sky, some capped, some still raw-edged. From a distance it looked as if someone had started to build a mountain in the middle of the town and then remembered that winter existed. Arnie stared, eyes wide. "It is like a cliff someone brought here," he breathed. "How many stones does it take to make that? More than we have fish in our fjord," Eirik said, and each rowed about by 3 men. They guided the sled through the outer lanes, past smaller houses where smoke smelled of simple food and simple lives, past workshops where hammers beat rhythm into the air. Children glanced up from their games, eyes measuring the newcomers, then went back to whatever complicated ice business they were engaged in. The lower market sat near the river, where boats could approach in gentler seasons. Stalls lined the open space, their canvas covers sagging under snow. Traders called out in voices trained to be heard over any wind. The goods looked like a collection of distant places brought together. Furs from the north, finer cloth from the south, iron tools, carved trinkets, sacks of grain. People moved between them in a shifting stream. Some wore the simple wool of farmers and fishermen. Others carried themselves with the ease of those who lived in towns, who spent more time arguing prices than watching the sky for weather. Eirik guided the sled into a corner and looped the reins around a post. The horse snorted, grateful for the chance to stand still and consider life. "Remember," Eirik told Arn, "traders talk fast. Do not let their words run ahead of your sense." Arn nodded, but his eyes were already sliding from stall to stall, drinking in the shapes and colours. They found Hakon where Mattias had said he would be, at a stall that smelled faintly of tallow and fresh shavings. Candles of varied sizes stood in ordered rows, and beside them lay carved figures, small animals, ships, men with crosses and men with swords. Hakon was a broad man with a beard that seemed to be having its own winter. He looked up as they approached, squinting as if he had already met more people than he cared to remember that day. "We are from the fjord village north of here," Eirik said. "Father Mattias sent us. He said you would know which merchants are more honest than others." "More honest," Hakon repeated. "That is like saying more dry than the sea, but I will do what I can." He shook Eirik's hand, then Arn's, gripping firmly. "Mattias," he said, thinking aloud. "Thin priest, earnest eyes, falls over his own feet." "That sounds like him," Eirik said. "He helped me once when my youngest was ill," Hakon added more quietly. "I will help his friends. What do you need?" They spoke of cloth, of salt, of flour fine enough for special bread. Hakon pointed out which stalls watered their grain and which cut their cloth with a generous edge instead of a mean. He did it without lowering his voice, as if daring the traders to object. Hanno wandered a little, staying within sight but letting his curiosity step ahead. He saw a stall selling charms where dragon heads and crosses hung together from a single line. Another offered belts embroidered with little symbols that could be read as old runes or new letters depending on which way one squinted. At one stall a woman sold small wooden figures. Some were of the old gods, familiar in shape. Others were of saints Hanno did not know, men and women holding books or staffs or strange tools. He picked up part of the saint figures, running his thumb along the carved line of its cloak. The face was calm, the eyes looking a little upward as if still expecting something. "That is good for travellers," the woman said. "He keeps watch on roads and bridges." The old gods did not care for bridges much, she added. They preferred boats, like sensible people. Arn smiled, then set the figure down. He could not justify spending on something so purely decorative, no matter how reassuring its calm face looked. Back at Hakon's stall, Eirik was in the middle of a small argument with a grain seller over the meaning of the word fair. Hakon supported him with loud commentary, which somehow made the other man lower his price to avoid further public evaluation of his honesty. When they had secured what they needed, and a little more besides, Eirik leaned on the sled briefly, listening to the sounds around them. "Hear that?" he said to Arn. "Listen." The boy frowned, then slowly nodded. "It is like the village," he said, but louder. "More people, more opinions, more laws," Eirik added. "The king's men walk these streets, the bishop's words travel these markets. Here, the new faith is not just a visitor, it is moving in." Arn watched a group of men hauling stones toward the church hill, slipping in the slush as they went. Others hurried past with baskets of food. A pair of boys darted between them all, laughing, one wearing a little carved hammer at his neck, the other a small cross. "Maybe," Arn said slowly, "the faith is not on thing. Maybe it changes when it comes here, then changes again when it comes to us." Eirik shrugged. "Everything changes when it travels," he said. "Even bread tastes different in another house." They found a tavern near the lower street that smelled less of spilled ale and more of stew, which Eirik took as a promising sign. Inside, the air was thick with steam and talk. Men and women sat on benches, shoulders hunched against a cold that still seeped through the walls despite the central fire. A dog snored under one table, legs twitching in dreams of better meals. They found a space on a bench and ordered something that claimed to be meat and barley. When it arrived, it was indeed meat and barley, and possibly one or two other things, but it was hot, and that was what mattered. Across the table sat a man with calloused hands and a short beard, a thin scar running from one eyebrow down across his cheek. He had the look of a craftsman who spent long days with tools and long nights with the consequences of those tools. "You are not from here," he observed, in the way of tavern conversations everywhere. "Your eyes are still counting how many ways the place can go wrong." Eirik smiled faintly. "From the fjord north of here," he said. "I build boats. Today I build errands for my wife." The man chuckled. "I am Gear," he said. "I work wood and stone. Boats when people need them, ornament for the church when they have coin." Arn perked up at that. "So you carve for both," he said. "The old dragon heads and the new crosses." Gear shrugged. "The tools are the same," he said. "The patterns change. A dragon mouth becomes a curling vine. A knot for Thor becomes a border for a saint. Stone does not care who it decorates." "Does that not bother you?" Arne asked, changing from one to the other. Gear took a slow drink before answering. "When I carve for the church," he said, "I am paid enough to feed my children and to spend time on work that will last a very long time. When I carve for ships, I see my work touch water and carry people over waves. Both have meaning. If the gods, old or new, have opinions about my chisel, they can speak God. So far, they have been quiet." Eirik nodded. That sounded like a philosophy he could respect. "The king wants this church to stand for many winters," Gear went on. "He wants its stone to speak of his faith and his power. That is his choice. My choice is how steady I hold my hand when I cut the lines." Arn thought of his own small carvings, of the cross and rune together on the disc he had made. "Maybe," he said slowly, "the person carving has more power than the person ordering." Gear smiled at that. "Maybe so," he said. "So carve well, boy. If you are going to confuse the gods, at least do it with skill." They ate in companionable silence for a while. Around them, conversations rose and fell. Someone sang a snatch of an old song, another answered with a few lines of a new hymn, both half drowned in laughter. "This city is full of in-between," Arn said quietly. "In between stone and wood, in between old and new." "That is where most of life happens," Eirik replied. "Out on the edge, in between." When they left the tavern, the light was fading again. The sky over the church hill glowed faintly as workers lit torches to finish one more small task before true dark. The air tasted of stone dust and soup and ambition. Before they left Nidaros the next morning, Arne took a few coins from the small pouch Solveig had insisted he carry. Not many, just enough to make a choice feel real. He walked back through the stirring market, the stalls being uncovered, the traders yawning and complaining about cold fingers. Eirik followed a few paces behind, letting the boy go first. At the charm stall, where carved bits of wood and bone hung in clustered lines, Arne studied each piece carefully. The trader watched him with practiced patience. Looking for protection, luck or romance, the man asked. Those are the three main categories. Just something to remind me, Arne said. Of this. He found it at last, small enough to sit in his palm. A simple pendant, a flat piece of wood smoothed by many hands, blank on one side, lightly carved on the other with a pattern that could be read as a cross or as intersecting lines, depending on how was looked. This one, Aring said. Good choice, the trader replied. It has not decided what it wants to be yet. That means it will follow you instead of the other way around. Aring handed over his coins, feeling the small weight of the trade. He turned and found Eirik watching him. You could have carved yourself, Aring said. I will, Aring replied. But this one began its life here, in the city. I want to carry both places. He slipped the cord over his neck, tucking the pendant under his tunic. His hand rested there for a moment, feeling the cool wood warm against his skin. On the way back through the streets, they passed the church again. Workers were hauling a carved stone to its place above a doorway. The carving showed a beast of some kind, its shape somewhere between lion and dragon, lines curling into each other. Arn pointed. That looks almost like the old stories. Almost, Eirik said. Perhaps the stone listened to two sets of tales. They reached the sled, loaded their purchases, and turned the horse toward home. As the city receded behind them, the road ahead looked both familiar and slightly changed, as if their eyes had learned a new way of measuring distance. On the way out, the air smelled of ambition and stone. On the way back, it smelled of snow and the memory of baking bread. Halfway along the road, after a silence, Arnie said, Father, yes? Do you think the gods mind if I learn from Matthias and still carve the old signs Eirik thought of gear in the tavern, of Hakon in the market, of children back home weaving stories onto sticks? I think, he said slowly, that whatever power made this world has more important things to worry about than the shape of the marks on your wood. I think what you do with your hands matters more than what you call it. Arnie nodded, satisfied for now. He adjusted his pendant, then tucked his hands back into his sleeves. The sled hissed over the snow, carrying them back toward the little village by the fjord, where Yule and Christmas were waiting to collide. Chapter 6. Hearthfire Promises. By the time Eirik and Arn reached the village again, the wind had grown tired of being dramatic and settled for being merely irritating. Snow still lay deep along the path, but it had lost its sharp edge. The trees seemed less like a crowd of stern onlookers and more like patient neighbours. The horse, sensing home, pulled with new energy. From above the last bend, they could see the smoke from the longhouses, thicker now, as if the village were breathing more deeply in preparation for the long night. Before they could even shout a greeting, Ragnar came pelting down the path, her cloak flapping, hat askew. She did not wait for the sled to stop before she grabbed the runner with both hands. You are back, she said, as if the evidence might be misleading. The boar is still in his pen, Matthias did not freeze, and the goat costume only fell over twice while practicing. We did everything while you were gone. Mostly. Eirik blinked. That is a full report, he said. Arnie hopped off the sled and swept his sister into a quick, awkward hug. We saw Nidaros, he said, and the church, and a man who carves for both. Ragnar stepped back to look at him. You smell like tavern smoke, she observed. That mean the food was hot, Eirik said. You would have approved. They guided the sled into its usual spot near the storage shed. The horse shook itself vigorously, sending a small storm of frost into the air. Eirik patted its neck in gratitude. It had carried them there and back without complaint, which was more than could be said for many Hewans. Inside the longhouse, warmth hit them like a friendly wall. The hearth burned bright, bread smells lingered, and the usual clutter seemed to have multiplied while they were away. Sylvie came forward, wiping her hands on her apron. She did not rush, but there was a quickness in her movements that gave her away. "You are back," she said in the same tone Ragnar had used, as if double-checking. Eirik lifted the sack of flour like a trophy. "Cloth, salt, flour, and most of my patience," he reported. She took the flour as if it were a chest of treasure. "Good," she said. "The special bread will not have to pretend quite so hard." Matthias appeared from behind a hanging curtain, where he had clearly been attempting to help Ingrid with something. "I tried to repair your broken stool," he said. "It was wobbling." Eirik glanced at the stool in question. It now had 3 legs of slightly different lengths and a 4th bracing piece that seemed to serve no clear purpose. Matthias added, "It wobbles differently now." Eirik considered the stool, then the priest. "That is a kind description," he said. "Fortunately, we have returned with more wood and fewer ambitions." Ragnar tugged at Arna's sleeve. "Show them," she whispered. Arn nodded and pulled the pendant from under his tunic for a brief moment, letting the carved lines catch the light. "I bought this," he said, "from a stall near the church. It can be read as a cross or as intersecting paths. I liked that." Ragnar touched it lightly with one finger, as if testing whether it carried any sparks from the city. Solveig raised an eyebrow. "You spent your own coins on it?" she asked. "Yes," Arn said. "I wanted something that began there, so I can carry a piece of that world and this one together." Solveig studied his face, then nodded. "As long as it does not replace your chores," she said. "You cannot hang it around the goat and expect it to clean the floor for you." Arn grinned. "That would be a miracle worth writing down," he said. Later, as the bust of unpacking gave way to the calmer hum of evening, Eirik took stock quietly. The village looked much as it had when he left, but with small differences. The new goat costume stood a little straighter, the decorated boar pen had gained another strip of cloth, and what looked suspiciously like a carved cross tucked into one corner, half hidden under straw. The baskets for gifts had filled further, with bits of colour and texture peeking from under covering cloths. People nodded to him with that blend of welcome and expectation that meant they were glad he had returned, and also glad he could now share the worries again. After the evening meal, when the younger children had been persuaded into their sleeping spaces, Eirik and Solveig finally had a few breaths together near the hearth, without someone tugging their sleeves. "Tell me," she said. "How was the city?" "Loud," Eirik said. "Wet. Full of stone that thinks too highly of itself. The church looks like a cliff halfway grown." "And the people?" she asked. "Like us," he said. "Just more crowded. Some pray in the new way. Some still mutter the old names when they think no one hears. Many do both, just in case." Solveig poked the fire with a stick, sending a small spray of sparks upward. "And you," she said. "What did you think?" He considered his answer. "It is a place where decisions are made that reach even here," he said. "Kings and bishops and men who carve important stones. But the bread still burns if they forget it in the oven. That reminded me we are not so far apart." Solveig smiled faintly. "We had our own near disaster with bread while you were gone," she said. "Ragnar saved it." Eirik looked toward his sleeping daughter, a small bundle of blanket and hair. "Good," he said. "Someone must keep the world from falling into the fire." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the breathing of the house. The glow from the hearth painted their faces in soft gold and shadow. "Our children are standing 2 worlds now," Solveig said at last. Arn with his city pendant and his questions for Matthias, Ragnar with her fierce love for the old stories, and her new confidence by the oven. Eirik nodded. "The world itself is standing in 2 stories," he said. "We cannot push them back into just one. We can only make sure they have a hearth that stays the same while everything else shifts." Solveig leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. "That," she said, "is more important than the arguments of kings." Later that night, long after the house had gone quiet again, there was a knock at the door. Not the dramatic pounding of the Yule goat, but a more hesitant, almost apologetic sound. Eirik rose, muttering to his knees, and opened the door a crack. A gust of cold air tried to argue its way inside. Behind it stood Torgrim, cloak dusted with snow, beard slightly damp. "You are up late," Eirik said. "Either the gods are restless, or your joints are." "Both," Torgrim replied. "May I come in for a moment?" Eirik stepped aside. The old Goddy entered, leaning his staff against the wall. The fire, banked low for the night, still gave enough light to paint lines on his face that Eirik usually did not see in daylight. Solveig stirred at the sound and sat up, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. "We have no fresh bread at this hour," she warned. "Only talk." "Talk may be more filling," Torgrim said. "I will risk it." They settled around the quiet hearth. For a time Torgrim did not speak. He simply stared into the coals as if trying to read the shape of coming days in their slow movements. At last he said, "When I was a young man, the world felt very simple. The gods were many, the seasons turned. We poured ale, told stories, and trusted that if we kept the rites, life would continue." Eirik nodded. "I imagine it did. Simpler does not always mean easier, though." Torgrim smiled thinly. "No. There were raids, harsh winters, poor harvests, but at least I knew which songs to sing." He glanced at them both. "Now a new faith comes with kings and priests and stone churches. It says my stories are wrong, that my gods are only shadows, that my staff is a stick from an old tree that will be cut down." His hand tightened on the wood as he spoke. "I am tired," he admitted, "more tired than I expected to be at this part of life. I do not care to argue every day, but I also do not want the people to forget who they have been." Solveig listened, face serious. "The children will remember the stories if we keep telling them," she said, "even if they also learn new ones." Torgrim shook his head slightly. "Stories change. That is their nature. It is the shape of the village I worry about. If the king insists we all become one thing, what happens to people who do not fit that shape?" Eirik thought of Geir in Nidaros carving dragons into vines, of Hakon selling candles and charms side by side, of Arnair with the pendant at his chest. "You are not only the keeper of old gods," Eirik said slowly. "You are also the keeper of this village's memory. You stood at our births, named our children, spoke at our funerals. Kings and bishops do not know those names. You do." Torgrim grunted, uncomfortable with praise. "Names do not impress rulers," he said. "They care about numbers." "They impress the people who live here," Solveig said. "When they are afraid, they come to you. They do not run to Nidaros." Torgrim's shoulders sagged a little. "For how long?" he asked. "When Matthias holds his mass and some children feel moved, when the bishop sends more priests, when the king demands stricter obedience. How long until there is no place by the hearth for old men with rune-carved staffs?" "As long as I have a hearth," Eirik said. "There will be a place by it for anyone who kept this village alive before I was born. Priest or Godey, old or new. If they come in peace and help keep the roof from falling, they can stay." Solveig nodded firmly. "We decide who sits at our fire," she said. "Not the king, not the bishop, not even the gods. They can argue about the sky. This house is ours." Torgrim looked at them both, something unsteady flickering in his gaze. After a moment he reached out and rested his weathered hand briefly on Eirik's shoulder. "You speak plainly," he said. "Your grandfather would have approved." Eirik felt a small warmth in his chest at that. Approval from the dead, even second-hand, was not lightly given. Torgrim rose, joints protesting. "I will continue to lead the Yule rites this year," he said. "I will tell the old stories by the log, but I will also not stand in the doorway when Matthias speaks his prayers in the morning. If people wish to listen, I will not forbid it." "That is more generous than some in your place might be," Solveig said. Torgrim snorted. "I am not generous, I am practical. A village pulled in two directions breaks. I would rather bend than watch it split." He reached for his staff and paused. "Promise me something," he said. "If it is within sense," Eirik replied. "If, in years to come, this village forgets my name," Torgrim said quietly, "remember at least that I tried to keep it whole, even if the gods I serve fade." Eirik's answer was simple. "I promise," he said. Solveig added, "We will tell our children that Torgrim cared more for people than for being right in every argument. That is a better legacy than any stone." The old man's eyes shone briefly in the firelight. Then he turned away, pulling his cloak around him. "Sleep," he said gruffly. "The long night will not wait for you to be well rested." When he had gone and the door was closed again against the cold, Eirik sat in silence for a while. feeling the weight of the promise he had just made. It was not a heavy weight exactly, more like a warm stone in his pocket, something that reminded him of responsibility whenever he shifted. Solveig lay back down, pulling the blanket up. "Do you think we can do it?" she asked softly. "Keep this place warm enough for everyone, no matter which prayers they say." Eirik looked at the ember bed, glowing steadily. "We can try," he said. "We can keep the fire fed, the roof mended, the bread as unburnt as possible. We can teach our children that kindness is not a luxury. Beyond that, the world will do as it pleases." She gave a tired laugh. "That sounds almost hopeful," she said. "It is the best kind of hope," Eirik replied, quiet and stubborn. He settled down beside her, listening to the night. The wind whispered its usual complaints outside, testing shutters and gaffs. Inside, the house breathed around them, a soft chorus of sleeping bodies and creaking wood. In the dim warmth, Eirik thought of the many kinds of promises that hung over the coming days. Kings promising order, priests promising salvation, old gods promising luck and courage. His own promise felt smaller and more possible. Keep the hearth warm. Keep the doors open. Keep the village from tearing itself apart over names and stones. He could not control the tides of faith and power that washed from Nidaros, but he could mend beams, carry wood, listen when old men came late at night with worries too large to hold alone. He let his eyes close, the image of the half-finished stone church fading into the warm dark, replaced by the certain shape of his own low roof, smoke-darkened beams, and the circle of light around the hearths. Whatever stories they told in the morning, this fire would be their anchor. Chapter 7. Midwinter Storm. The storm arrived before the long night, as if it wanted a rehearsal of its own. It began with a change in the air that Eirik felt in his bones before he saw it in the sky. The wind shifted from merely bothersome to purposeful. The clouds thickened, low and heavy, like a ceiling full of unspoken complaints. By midday, fine snow started to fall. By afternoon, the flakes grew thicker, driven at an angle that found every gap in every cloak. By evening, the world outside the longhouse door had become a white wall with opinions. Eirik closed the door against a new gust and dropped the bar into place. Snow still glittered on his beard and in his hair. He shook himself like a wet dog and stamped warmth back into his feet. "That is not just a polite storm," he said. "That is the kind that wants to see what breaks." Solveig glanced up from the hearth, where she was coaxing the fire into a more generous mood. "Then we will not give it anything easy," she said. "Is the roof sound?" "For now," Eirik replied. "Ask me again when the wind has had a full night to argue with it." Ragnar and 2 younger children were spreading extra straw along one wall, turning it into another sleeping space. The long night traditions meant gatherings, music, and too little floor for the number of people who insisted they had always slept there in past years. Arne came in behind Eirik, arms full of firewood. He dropped the load near the hearth and straightened, cheeks red from cold. "The path to the far houses is already hard to see," he reported. "If anyone means to go anywhere, this is their last sensible chance." As if summoned by the words, there came a pounding at the door. Not the playful knock of the Yule goat, but the solid insistence of many hands. Eirik exchanged a glance with Solveig, then lifted the bar again. A blast of cold air and snow followed the door in. Behind it came half the village. People pushed in with the storm at their backs. Cloaks were crusted with snow, hats pulled low, boots heavy with clinging slush. Father Matthias stumbled in among them, clutching a small pack to his chest as if it contained something that should never be dropped. Behind him, Torgrim entered, moving more slowly but with the steady determination of a man who refused to be impressed by weather. "The road to the outer farms is closing," an elder called over the rising noise. "The drifts are already to my knees. The smaller longhouses will not hold against this wind," another said. "Their roof beams are too old." "We cannot leave people alone out there," Solveig said. There was no drama in her voice, only fact. "They come," Torgrim said. "I passed some on the path." The farm by the birch grove is sending their children ahead while the adults secure the animals. Eirik looked at the narrow space of the longhouse, at the benches, at the limited stretch of floor. Then he looked at the storm crowding the door. "We can fit them," he said. "We have squeezed more into a boat." "Not with that much complaining," Solveig muttered, but she was already moving, shoving benches closer to the walls, directing children to stack chests, clearing every span of empty ground. The house filled fast. Wet wool and cold air came in. Warmth and comfort pushed back but did not surrender. People shook off snow and tried to find places for their boots that did not trip anyone. Matthias, clutching his pack, made his way toward Eirik. "I thought it best to come here," he said. "The small room where I have been staying might lose its roof, and if I am to be blown into a snowdrift by the hand of God, I would rather it not happen alone." Eirik snorted. "You are welcome," he said, "but your share of air will cost you stories later." "That seems fair," Matthias replied. Even before the last of the arriving families squeezed into corners, Solveig had the older children moving. Cloaks here, boots there, wet things arranged where the fire might bully the damp out of them. She sent Arn and 2 others to check on the goat costume and the festive breads, as if the season itself might fall apart if those 2 things did. Ragnar found herself helping a small boy from the far farm settle near the hearth. His eyes were huge, his hands clenched around a little wooden horse. "Is it always like that?" he whispered. "No," Ragnar said honestly. "Sometimes it is worse." He stared at her, then noticed the faint smile tugging at her mouth, and released a small frightened breath that might someday grow into a laugh. Outside, the storm howled and threw itself against the walls. Inside, the longhouse stretched its seams and held. By the time the last guest arrived, cheeks raw from the wind, there was almost no bare floor left. People sat shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, backs against chests, strangers pressed together by necessity until they were no longer exactly strangers. Torgrim stood near the centre, leaning on his staff. His white beard looked like part of the snowstorm that had accidentally wandered inside. "It seems," he said dryly, "that the gods have decided we will not be travelling between houses for our rites this year." Matthias, seated not far away with his back against a post, gave a tired nod. "The Lord sometimes gathers people in one place for a reason," he said, "usually to teach them patience." "If that is the lesson," Torgrim replied, "this village is about to become very holy." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Tension loosened, just a little. Solveig clapped her hands for attention, a sound that cut surprisingly sharp through the storm and the murmurs. "Listen," she said. "We have many people and hearth. That means we must be careful. No one sits so close to the fire that their cloak catches. No one wastes food. No one wakes my youngest if they can help it. And anyone who starts an argument about gods will be handed a broom and told to sweep under everyone." Heads nodded. Even in a storm, no one wanted that much responsibility. The storm roared, the longhouse breathed. Eirik felt the walls creak with the weight of snow and air, but the beams held, just as he had known they would. Mostly known. Mostly. As evening settled, the difference between guests and hosts dissolved. Everyone became simply one more body sharing the air. Bowls of stew made thin by necessity but hot by determination went from hand to hand. Children shared blankets and whispered small, serious plans about where they would sleep and who would get the warmest spot. An infant cried briefly, then settled against a mother's chest, the tiny sound almost lost in the many-layered murmurs. Eirik sat near the hearth, legs stretched out as far as space allowed, feeling the familiar aches in his shoulders. He could not move without bumping into someone. At Ben elbow, Matthias leaned against the bench. At the other, Torgrim sat, staff across his knees. The arrangement looked like the beginning of a joke. A priest, a goadie, and a shipbuilder walk into a winter storm, Eirik thought. He decided not to say it aloud. The gods, old or new, might have less humour than the people in the room. The children, sensing that the adults were too tired to protest much, began to ask for stories. "We cannot go out," small girl said. "We cannot sing loudly or the baby will wake. So we must have tales." Torgrim lifted his head. "Tales are not simply for entertainment," he said. They are how we remember who we are. That too, the girl agreed, but they are also for not being bored. Matthias smiled. I have no objection to preventing boredom, he said. It is often where trouble begins. Several children looked at him with interest. Tell us about your faraway child, demanded, the one born in the stable. It is not my child, Matthias said, but I can tell you the story again. Torgrim shifted. Before that, he said, we will have one of the old tales. The storm is a good time for it. He glanced around the crowded room. People settled more comfortably, pulling blankets tighter. The storm outside battered and howled, but inside there was a tension to spare. Torgrim began to speak, his voice deep and steady, like a drum behind the wind. He told of a long-ago winter when the world had nearly frozen, of gods who walked among people to see, who kept their fires bright, of a family in a small house by a fjord who shared their last loaf with a stranger, not knowing he was more than he seemed. In return, their house was sheltered, while others suffered the full bitterness of the storm. It was an old story. Eirik had heard it many times as a boy, sitting by another hearth with his own parents. He could see the familiar beats of it in the minds of others, the comfort of knowing what came next. When Torgrim reached the part where the stranger revealed himself as a god of storms and of hidden tests, several children leaned forward, mouthed the lines along with him, then sighed in satisfaction when the family found their stores mysteriously full in the morning. So, Torgrim finished, the gods do not always speak in thunder. Sometimes they speak through empty stomachs and a neighbour knocking on your door. Arni caught Eirik's eye. That sounds suspiciously like Matthias, he whispered, except with less snow in his beard. When the murmurs of appreciation faded, several faces turned toward the priest. He cleared his throat, aware of the weight of attention. In the land where the Christ child was born, he began, the winters are not like this. There is cold, yes, but not that kind of biting wind. The night when he was born, the sky was clear. There were shepherds in the fields watching their flocks, not boars in pens and goats made of straw, but sheep. Ragnar considered this. Poor people, she muttered, no goats. Matthias continued, those shepherds were the least important people, he said. No one wrote down their names. They slept outside while others slept indoors. They were tired and probably smelled like their animals. And yet it was to them that the angels came. Several children straightened. Angels, even ones badly described, usually improved a tale. What are angels? A boy asked. Like spirits, Matthias thought. Messengers, he said. Not exactly gods, servants of God, bright ones. Dangerous in their own way, but on the side of light. The shepherds saw the sky fill with light, he went on. They heard a voice tell them that a child had been born in a town nearby, a child who would bring hope to many. So they went, leaving their sheep, trusting that something was more important than their work for a little while. Solveig, listening as she rearranged some blankets, lifted an eyebrow. Leaving their work, she repeated softly. That must have been serious. Matthias smiled. Very, he said. They found the child lying in a feeding trough, his parents poor, tired, probably worried. No palace, no fine clothes, just a small family in the middle of a world that did not know it had changed. He paused, letting the image settle. God chose to come into the world in a place like that, he said quietly. Not in a stone hall, not in a rich house, but in a space that smelled of animals and hay. Because that is where most people live, in one way or another, close to the rough edges. There was a silence after that, broken only by the storm outside and a baby's soft sigh. It is a little like here, Ragnar said finally. Many people in a small house, animals not too far away, a roof that complains when the wind shoves it. Matthias looked around the longhouse, at the crowded bodies, at the patched walls, at the low smoke. His eyes warmed. Yes, he said. It is a little like here. Torgrim sniffed. Your story is not so different from ours, he said. Gods coming as strangers, families sharing food. The details change. The bones of it remain. Eirik leaned his head back against the post. He could feel the tiredness of the room, the way shoulders sank as people allowed the stories to carry some of their weight. "Tell another," someone murmured, and so they did. Old sagas trimmed of their sharper edges, new tales of saints with more kindness than glory, family stories of near disasters that ended in laughs, all stirred together like ingredients in a large pot. As the night deepened, voices blurred. Some listeners drifted into sleep with a story only half finished in their ears, content to wake later and ask how it ended. There, in the layered darkness, surrounded by words and breathing and the stubborn crack of the fire, the village did something more important than deciding between gods. It remembered how to sit together and wait out a storm without turning on itself. The hour grew late enough that time lost shape. Eirik felt himself drifting in and out of shallow sleep, catching pieces of tales, the weight of a child's head briefly against his knee, the soft clink of a cup set carefully down. At some point the storm's voice changed. It did not stop, not entirely, but it shifted from a furious howl to a tired moan. The wind slackened, as if it had worn itself out against the stubborn beams of the houses. Someone near the door cracked it open a finger width and peered out. Snow pressed against the gap like a curious animal. "Still wild," the watcher reported, but less angry. "That qualifies as good news," Eirik murmured. At last, even Torgrim's stories faded. His voice sank to a rough murmur, then stopped altogether. Matthias dropped off mid-sentence only to jerk awake and apologize, his words tumbling over each other in embarrassment. "Sleep," Solvi said firmly. "Everyone. The storm will not leave more quickly because you stare at the roof." People settled where they could. Some lay on benches, some on straw, some sitting upright with backs against the wall and heads lolling. There was no such thing as privacy, only varying degrees of mutual politeness. Ragnar tucked herself between her parents, one hand resting on Eirik's arm, the other clutching her blanket. Arn found a spot near the wall, just under a hanging bundle of dried herbs, and fell asleep so quickly that Eirik suspected he had practiced. The fire burned low but steady. Solvik had banked it carefully, arranging the coals in a way that would keep them alive through the small hours. Eirik lay awake a little longer, listening to the combined breathing of a household expanded into a small world. Children murmured in dreams. Someone snored in an impressive rhythm. The baby, miraculously, slept. He glanced sideways. Matthias lay not far away, wrapped in his cloak, one hand still resting lightly on the pack he had carried in. Even in sleep there was a faint furrow between his brows, as if he were arguing gently with someone in his dreams. Torgrim slept sitting up, head bowed over his staff. The old symbols carved into the wood seemed to pulse briefly in the uncertain light. Storm outside, storm inside, Eirik thought. Both quieter now, for the moment. He let his eyes close at last. The last thing he felt before sleep took him was Ragnar's fingers tightening once on his sleeve, as if making sure he was still there. He was. For tonight, that was enough. Chapter 8. The Quiet Miracle. When morning finally crawled over the lip of the world, it did so reluctantly, like someone peeking into a crowded room and unsure whether to enter. The storm had spent itself. Outside the longhouse, the world lay buried under a deep, uneven blanket of snow. Drifts leaned against walls. The path to the sheds had vanished, replaced by a smooth whiteness in which only the bravest footsteps had begun to carve new lines. Inside, the air still held the layered smell of too many people and not enough fresh breeze. The fire was being coaxed back to lively flame by Solveig, who had risen before most others as usual. Eirik woke with the particular stiffness that came from sleeping in a strange position on too little floor. His back informed him that he was not as young as he pretended to be. He sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Ragnar, who had curled like a cat against his side. Around him people stirred. Someone groaned quietly. A child giggled in that odd voice children have when they wake from nightmares to find they are not alone. We survived the storm, Eirik thought. That counted for something. It did not take long for the next problem to show its face. A woman from the far farm, the what near the birch grove, knelt near the back of the longhouse, her body curved protectively over a bundle of blankets. Her voice cut through the morning mutter, low and strained. "He is too hot," she said. "I cannot wake him properly." The words cracked whatever fragile sense of safety the room had built overnight. Fear travels faster than wind in a crowded house. Heads turned, eyes sharpened. Solveig was there first. She moved with a quiet urgency that made a space open around her without needing to ask. Eirik followed, his own sleepiness blown away in an instant. The boy in the blankets was perhaps 5 winters old. His face shone with a too bright flush, skin damp, hair plastered to his forehead. His breaths came shallow and fast. When Solveig touched his cheek, she drew her hand back almost at once. "He burns," she said. The mother's hands twisted on the edge of the blanket. "He coughed all night," she whispered. "I thought it was the smoke. We gave him water. Now he does not answer me." Her voice trembled on the last words, as if speaking them might make them more true. Eirik felt the room tighten. In a hard winter, sickness was a fear deeper than cold. One storm could bring the village together. A fever could take someone away and leave an empty place no story could fill. Torgrim pushed himself up with his staff and came closer, eyes hooded. Matthias, not far behind, knelt opposite Solveig, his hand hovering above the boy as if he wanted to help but feared to make things worse by ignorance. "How long?" Eirik asked softly. "Since the darkest part of the night," the mother said. He woke and coughed. Then his skin grew hot. He was restless, then heavy. "I kept thinking it would pass." That was the way of such things, Eirik knew. You waited, hoping the sickness would turn back on its own, feeling the gap between concern and real fear close too quickly. Solveig's voice when she spoke was crisp and steady, a rope thrown across rising panic. "We must cool him," she said. "Not with snow. That is for strong men who eat too much, not for children in fever. We will use cloths and water, and we will brew something." She looked up, eyes sweeping the room. "Bring water, clean cloth." The herbs from the 3rd bundle overhead, the ones tied with the red thread, not the blue. People moved at once, grateful for instructions. In a crisis, tasks were as important as remedies. They kept hands from shaking. Torgrim murmured, "I can say the old words. For protection, it cannot hurt." Matthias nodded. "I will pray as well," he said, quietly. "The boy does not need shouting now." No one argued about gods or methods. The only question in the room was whether the child would come back to them. Ragnar hovered near the edge of the gathered adults, eyes wide, fists clenched at her sides. Arn stood behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder, more for his comfort than for hers. "Will he be all right?" Ragnar whispered. "We do not know yet," Arn said. Honesty tasted bitter in his mouth. He wished he had a softer answer. "It sounds like the stories," Ragnar went on, words tumbling out. "When the gods test people by making someone sick." "This is not a test," Arn said. "It is just bad luck and bad weather. Maybe the gods do not care enough to send tests on purpose," Ragnar said. "Maybe they just do not stop things." Arn had no answer for that. She was probably too close to the truth. The longhouse shifted into a strange rhythm. On one side of the room, life continued in small, necessary ways. People ate a little, checked their boots, spoke quietly. On the other side, near the back wall, all attention narrowed to the boy on the blankets. Selvi mixed herbs in a bowl, crushing them with the back of a spoon, adding water in careful amounts. The scent rose sharp and bitter, cutting through the thicker smells of smoke and bodies. "This will not work miracles," she said, more to manage expectations than to discourage hope. "It may help his body fight, it may not, but it is what we can do." She coaxed a little of the mixture into the boy's mouth, drop by drop, careful not to choke him. His throat worked weakly, accepting some of it. Torgrim stood at the head of the blanket, hands hovering over the boy. He whispered old words, barely audible above the crack of the fire. They spoke of protection, of spirits turning their faces away from this child, of luck circling back like a wind that had changed its mind. Matthias knelt at the boy's side, hands clasped. His lips moved in prayer, but he did not raise his voice. No grand declarations, no demands, just quiet pleading in the shape of simple words. Eirik watched them for a moment, these two men who had argued over gods and rights now working side by side, their differences thinned by the sight of a small hot face. If there is any justice, he thought, whatever listens will hear both of them. Time became something to be endured, measured in shallow breaths and the changing temperature of a child's skin. They cooled him with damp cloths, they changed his blankets when sweat soaked them through, they turned him gently to ease his breathing. Solvig's herbal brew was given in small amounts, steady as a drumbeat. Outside, the storm continued to rearrange snow, but none of the villagers cared what shape it took. Their world had narrowed to the few square feet around the boy. People took turns tending the fire, fetching water, carrying news between those pressed near the back wall and those further away. No one went far. Even the restless children played close, voices muted by the weight in the air. At dough point, Ingrid moved through the crowd with a calm that impressed Eirik. She checked on the other children from the far farm, making sure they had eaten, that their fear had not turned into something brittle. Thomas helped her, his usual awkwardness smoothed by purpose. Ragnar refused to be sent away entirely. She stayed where she could see without being in the way. Once, when Solvig stepped back to rest her hands for a moment, Ragnar slipped forward with a fresh cloth, awkward but careful. "May I?" she asked. Solvig hesitated only a heartbeat, then nodded gently. Ragnar laid the cool cloth over the boy's forehead, her fingers trembling just a little. In that moment he did not look like a stranger to her. He looked like every child she had ever known, every friend, every cousin, every version of herself in times of fever. Under her touch the boy stirred faintly, his lips moving in a soundless murmur. She held her breath, as if any sudden movement might scare him back into stillness. He did not wake, but he did not sink deeper either. She stepped back, satisfied and deeply unsettled. The hours crawled. Morning stretched into midday without anyone quite noticing. Someone passed a bowl of thin stew around. People took small sips more out of obedience than hunger. Eirik forced himself to eat something. A man who had not eaten could not carry wood or lift a beam if the longhouse suddenly needed repair. Responsibility demanded fuel. At dud point, Matthias left the boy's side long enough to come to the fire. He accepted a cup of warm ale and held it without drinking at first. "You look as if your prayers have been working as hard as our herbs," Eirik said. Matthias gave a tired smile. "I keep telling God things he already knows," he said. "That the child is loved, that the winter is hard enough without this, that we are trying, even when we do not agree on names and stories." "Does he answer?" Arne asked quietly, appearing at Eirik's other side. "Not with words," Matthias said, "sometimes with a kind of peace, sometimes not at all. Today I do not feel peaceful, but I do not feel alone either." Arne turned that over in his mind, like a small stone in his hand. Torgrim joined them for a brief moment, leaning heavily on his staff. His face looked more lined than Eirik had ever seen it. "I have spoken every charm I know," he said, "the ones for heat leaving and breath returning. Either the spirits are listening, or they are as stubborn as the weather." "Perhaps both," Matthias said. They shared a look that would have been impossible a few days earlier. It was not agreement exactly, but something like mutual recognition. "Whatever power holds this child," Torgrim said, "it will not be persuaded by sleep. I am going back." Matthias nodded and followed. Afternoon edged toward evening. The light that managed to reach the smoke hole was thin and grey. Outside, the storm sputtered and faded, leaving stillness in its wake. Inside, people grew quiet with a more profound weariness. Waiting is its own kind of work, especially when it is done in close quarters with the fears of others. At some point, Eirik realized that he had been staring at the same knot in a roof beam for quite some time. He forced himself to move, to stand, to walk a small circle through the room, checking for small practical things that might be going wrong while everyone watched the larger crisis. He found a child starting to shiver under an insufficient blanket, and added another. He noticed a crack of cold air near the door and stuffed a scrap of cloth into it. He helped a man shift his sleeping mother closer to the fire. These small acts did not cure fevers. but they kept the rest of the house from fraying entirely. Ragnar drifted to his side as he worked, her face pale with tiredness. Her eyes kept sliding toward the back wall. "I keep thinking," she said, "of how all our stories almost ended there. If he goes, will that mean the gods chose Eirik?" Shook his head. "No," he said. "It will mean winter is cruel and bodies are fragile. The gods do not get to claim every sorrow and call it their work." She frowned. "But we always say the gods decide when we are born and when we go." "We say many things when we are trying to make sense of pain," Eirik replied. "It does not always mean we are right." Ragnar considered this, then gave a small nod. The world felt less tidy that way, but a little less harsh too. It happened in the shallow hours, that time when day is technically present but clearly not yet committed. The boy's fever had burned high and steady all night, like a cruel second fire in the room. His skin stayed hot under every cloth. His breath rasped. Every time Solveig or the mother thought it might be easing, it surged again. Then, as quietly as it had risen, it began to break. Solveig was the first to notice because her hand had become so used to the unnatural heat that even a small change felt shocking. "He is cooler," she said, voice hushed, as if afraid to draw attention from whatever had changed. "Feel." The mother pressed her palm to her son's forehead, then to his chest. Tears started in her eyes, sudden and fierce. "He is sweating," she whispered. "Really sweating. What it damp from heat. It is different." Torgrim, who had been repeating a final blessing in a hoarse whisper, stopped and frowned. He touched the boy's head with 2 fingers and let out a breath that sounded like relief carefully disguised as skepticism. "Perhaps the spirits have finished with their mischief," he said. Matthias, who had fallen into an exhausted half-doze against the wall not long before, scrambled back to his knees. He laid his hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. "The fever is going," he said softly. "It will take time for his strength to return, but the worst may be passing." The boy's breathing, still fast, had lost its harsh edge. His face, while still flushed, no longer shone with that frightening inner fire. His limbs, which had lain limp, twitched faintly as if remembering themselves. The mother bent over him and sobbed, a raw sound that made several others in the room blink hard. Eirik felt something tighten in his chest and then loosen again, like a rope being pulled and then released. People near the back wall began to murmur. The news travelled forward in ripples. "He is better," someone whispered. "The fever is breaking." Ragnar grabbed Arn's arm hard enough to leave marks. "See," she said, "it is like the stories." Something listened. "Maybe," Arn said. "Or maybe herbs and cloths and 2 stubborn old men talking to the sky did their work together." Ragnar nodded. That sounded right to her. It did not matter to her in that moment whether the answer had come from one god or many, or from the mysterious strength of the boy himself. What mattered was that he was turning back toward them. Matthias bowed his head for a moment, eyes closed. "Thank you," he said quietly, "to whoever might be listening." Then he added, "And while I am grateful, perhaps next time we could skip the part where everyone nearly breaks." Torgrim snorted. "You will not get agreement on that from any god I know," he said. "They seem very fond of drama." Solveig exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping. She had carried tension there for so many hours that letting it go felt almost dangerous, like stepping from ice onto firm ground. "We keep watching him," she said. "The fever can rise again, but for now let him sleep. And you," she added to the mother, "must drink some water before you fall over. The gods, old or new, do not thank people properly if they faint on top of their children." The mother laughed weakly through her tears and accepted the cup. Ingrid pushed into her hand. The longhouse, which had been holding its breath, finally exhaled. People smiled at Desanother with the dazed relief of survivors. No one shouted about miracles. No one declared victory for their faith. They simply sagged in place, glad to have one less grief to prepare for. Eirik went back to the hearth, where the fire crackled more cheerfully than it had in days. He added a log watching the flames catch. Matthias joined him a moment later, moving slowly like a man whose body had been carrying something heavy while standing still. "So," Eirik said, "what do you call that?" Matthias followed his gaze toward the back of the longhouse, where the boy now slept more peacefully, his mother's hand resting on his. In Nidaros, he said, some would call it a miracle. Some would say God answered our prayers in a special way. Others would say it was the herbs, the water, the care, and perhaps some natural turning of the fever. And you, Eirik asked. Matthias stared into the fire for a while. I think, he said slowly, that when many people care for what small life with everything they have, it is a kind of miracle whether or not God rearranges anything. If God helped, I am grateful. If he simply sat with us in the waiting, I am still grateful. Eirik grunted. That is a very priest answer. Matthias smiled crookedly. It is also a tired man answer, he said. Torgrim approached, his staff tapping softly on the ground. He looked less troubled than he had the night before, though the exhaustion in his eyes remained. In the old tales, he said, we would say that the spirits were appeased by the offerings and by the courage of the family. That they decided to let the child stay because they were reminded of their better nature. And you, Eirik asked, because it seemed fair. Torgrim shrugged slowly. I grow less certain each winter about what the spirits decide, he said. But I am sure of this. When we work together, the chances of seeing the next spring improve. That has always been true. He glanced at Matthias, then at Eirik. Whichever gods you serve, he said, try not to get in the way of that. Arne drifted into the small circle of light near the hearth, hands pushed deep into his sleeves. If the old gods and the new god both want us to care for each other, he said, maybe that is the part that matters. And if they do not, maybe we should care anyway and let them argue. Eirik looked at him, then at Ragnar, who had followed and now stood slightly behind her brother, eyes still shining with the remnants of fear and relief. You know, he said, if the gods shared your common sense, our lives would be easier. Solveig appeared with a pot in her hands and set it firmly on the hearth. Enough thinking, she said. Everyone will eat. Then everyone will sleep as much as they can before the next task arrives. What is the next task? Eirik asked warily. She gave him a pointed look. Preparing for a feast in a village that has just survived a storm and a sickness, she said. We will be celebrating more than one thing now. Yule, Christmas, and the fact that we still have all our children. Eirik nodded. That last one, he thought, was reason enough for a festival all by itself. Later, when some of the extra guests had begun the slow journey back to their own houses, testing the depth of the snow with cautious steps, Eirik stood in the doorway with Ragnar. The sky was a hard, clear blue now. The storm had scoured it clean. The sun sat low but bright, throwing sharp light on every drift and roof. It looks different, Ragnar said quietly. The snow? Eirik asked. The world, she answered. He followed her gaze. The same houses, the same trees, the same fjord beyond, its ice crust glittering. It is the same, he said. We are the ones who feel different. Last night we were not sure if we would all still be standing together today. Now we know that at least for this moment, we are. She thought about the boy still sleeping in the longhouse behind them, about his mother's tears, about the way Torgrim and Matthias had stood together without fighting. I think, she said, that if we do not do something kind at the feast, the world will be disappointed. Eirik smiled. That is a good way to measure things, he said. Would the world be disappointed if we chose otherwise? She slipped her hand into his, a small warm weight. Do you think the gods saw? She asked. He squeezed her hand gently. I think, he said, that if they are worth following, they did. Ragnar nodded, satisfied in her own way. For her, the question was less about theology and more about whether kindness was noticed by anything larger than the people in the room. Inside, Solveig was already making new lists in her head, adjusting recipes to account for the drained stores and the extra reasons to be grateful. Torgrim was resting his voice in preparation for the stories he would tell at the Yule log. Matthias was thinking about how he would speak of hope at his first Christmas Mass in this stubborn village by the fjord. Eirik looked at the sky, at the path, at the faint curl of smoke from the far farm where the boy had been born. He felt both smaller and more solid than before. Winter had thrown its first serious test. They had not lost anyone. That was not a victory they could count on every year. But they had it now, and it would carry them forward. He stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind him. There was still work to do. Bread to bake, benches to mend, songs to remember. Yule and Christmas would not wait for everyone to feel fully ready. They never did. But for the first time, this strange season felt less like two rival feasts and more like one long shared prayer for warmth, for survival, and for a kindness that did not care which god received the thanks. Chapter 9. First Morning of Christmas. The morning after the storm and the fever felt like waking up in a house that had argued with the sky and won by a narrow margin. Light slipped in through the roof hole, pale and sharp, catching on the drifting smoke. It was not generous light, but it was honest. Outside, the world lay deep in snow, shaped into soft hills against every wall and fence. The wind, exhausted, had gone off to bother some other unlucky valley. Inside the longhouse, people moved slowly, as if their bones had forgotten how to bend in all the right places. One by one, families from the outer houses prepared to trudge back through the snow to their own hearths. There was shuffling, apologizing, retrieving of misplaced mittens, and the universal winter game of whose boot is theirs. Eirik stood by the door, helping people through the narrow gap between warmth and brightness. Each time he opened it, a blast of cold slapped him awake again. "Remember to clear your roofs first," Solveig called out as a woman pulled on her cloak. "The snow is heavy. If you wait, you will be sleeping under the sky, and not in a poetic way." "We will," the woman promised. She glanced toward the back corner, where her son lay sleeping, cheeks no longer burning. Her gaze softened, and she nodded again, as if to the house itself, and went out into the glittering day. When at last the number of bodies returned to something like normal, the longhouse felt both larger and strangely empty. Eirik realized he could stretch out one leg without kicking anyone. This felt decadent. Ragnar stood on the bench and peered out the small side opening they used to let smoke escape faster. "It is beautiful," she said, "in the way that wants you to forget it is dangerous." "That is Winter's favorite trick," Eirik replied, shrugging into his outer coat. He took an extra breath of warm air before stepping outside. The sky had settled into a clear icy blue. The sun sat low, but there was a faint new confidence in its light, as if it had remembered its job and might someday do it properly again. Snow glittered over every roof, every tree branch, every fence post. The path to the boar pen was a series of trenches where someone had already trudged back and forth on some urgent pig business. Other villagers had emerged too, blinking in the brightness. They looked like underground creatures dragged into daylight, all pale faces and cautious steps. Some began to dig paths, others simply stood and stared, confirming the village was still exactly where they had left it yesterday. From somewhere down the slope came a whoop of satisfaction. "The goat stayed up," Cole shouted. "We tested it twice." "Good," Eirik called back. "If anything deserves to survive that storm, it is a pile of straw and stubbornness." Arne joined him, eyes scanning the horizon. The fjord lay under a thick crust of ice near the shore, darker patches hinting at deeper water beyond. "We did it," Arne said quietly. "We kept everyone. For now," Eirik said. "That is enough for one morning." He meant it. It was not a small thing. The village had faced a storm that could have broken beams and spirits. It had thrown in a fever for extra measure, yet here they all were, standing on aching legs, ready to complain and work in equal measure. Across the open space, Father Matthias emerged from his temporary lodging near the elder's house, cloak wrapped tight. He looked as if he had aged a little in 9 light, which Eirik supposed was what happened when a priest discovered that theology did not include clear instructions for sleepless fever vigils. Torgrim came out of his own house a moment later, leaning more heavily than usual on his staff. His expression, as he surveyed the snow, was one part disapproval and one part reluctant admiration. "The sky threw everything it had at us," he said as Eirik approached. "We are still standing. That is a good sign. Or a sign the sky is not very good at its job," Eirik suggested, Torgrim snorting. Do not insult it too loudly, it might hear. Nidaros joined them, breath puffing in white clouds. We said we would mark the first light after the storm with prayer, he said, and with your Yule rites. I do not think I can persuade anyone to climb the hill to a stone altar today. Torgrim glanced at the deep snow. Only if you wish the first miracle you perform here to be resurrection, he said. No, we will gather just beyond the houses where the ground is not plotting against us. So it was decided the first morning of their strange shared season would be greeted not at some grand altar, but in a trampled circle of snow between the longhouses, near the boar pen and the path to the goat. By the time they gathered, the sun had climbed as high as it was willing to for that day. Its light hit the snow and bounced back into everyone's eyes with cheerful aggression. Villagers stood in a loose circle, boots sinking, cloaks pulled close. Children fidgeted, steam rising from their mouths as they whispered. The boy who had been ill stood wrapped in blankets held firmly by his mother. His face was pale, eyes tired, but he was upright, which several people glanced at more than once, as if best to confirm it. The decorated boar watched from his pen with dignified interest, wreath slightly askew. The new Yule goat costume lurked near the edge of the group, propped on its frame and waiting for its next chance to start someone's heart and amuse them in the same beat. Torgrim stepped forward first. His breath came out in a small cloud that hung in the air as he spoke. "We have seen the storm," he said. "We have felt the wind push at our walls. We have heard the snow thump onto our roofs like a careless child jumping above. Our houses did not fall. Our people did not vanish into the drifts. For that we give thanks." His voice carried clearly in the cold. He spoke the old words, calling on gods who had watched this fjord for longer than anyone could remember, asking for continued luck, for strong beams, for good health, for enough food that no one had to choose between hunger and pride. He nodded once toward the boar pen. "This animal will give us strength," he said. "We honor it. We honor the work that fed it and the hands that will prepare it. May those who swear oaths over it remember them when the snow has melted and their excuses return." A ripple of low amusement passed through the crowd. Torgrim's reputation for remembering broken promises was well established. When he stepped back, there was a pause long enough to feel like a choice. Matthias stepped forward into that space. He looked around at the faces turned toward him, some wary, some hopeful, some just cold and impatient. "We have seen the storm," he said, echoing Torgrim. "We have felt fear and tiredness, and the weight of watching one small child burn with fever. We have felt relief as that fever faded. For that we give thanks as well." He folded his hands. "I speak to the God I know," he said. "The one I believe came into the world as a child. Poor, fragile, in a place not much better than a crowded longhouse in winter. I ask him to bless this village, to keep its people warm, its children growing, its old ones respected, to give us patience with another as we learn how to live with more than one story in our heads." His words were simple, without flourishes. They did not try to erase what Torgrim had just said. They sat alongside it, like another log on the fire. When he finished, there was another brief pause, filled with the faint hiss of the cold air in everyone's lungs. Eirik, standing near the back, realized something important. No one had stepped away during either blessing, no one had shouted or muttered insults. Some had closed their eyes during Torgrim's words, some during Matthias's, some had kept eyes open for both, but all had stayed. That, he thought, is what survival looks like in a place like that. Ragnar at his side whispered, "Does it count if I said my own small prayer in my head that the bread will not burn?" "It counts more than you know," he whispered back. Torgrim raised his staff and thumped it once in the snow. "Now," he said, "we have thanked the powers above. Let us thank, briefly, the people standing in front of us, to the neighbours who opened their doors, to the hands that carried wood and water, to the ones who watched over the sick while others slept. You have done well. Try not to become unbearable about it." There was laughter, warmer this time. Some clapped shoulders, others nodded. The mother of the recovered boy pulled her child closer, tears bright in her eyes despite the cold. Nidaros added, "And let us also remember that there are still roofs to clear, paths to dig, and food to stretch. God does not chop firewood. We do. That earned him a few more approving noises. Practicality spoke loudly here. The feast that followed was not grand by the standards of city churches or rich halls, but for people who had recently been unsure of seeing another sunrise, it looked generous enough. Inside Eirik and Solveig's longhouse, the long table had been stretched to its full, slightly ridiculous length. Extra boards had been added, supported by crates and barrels that creaked ominously but held. Benches lined both sides, polished smooth by many winters of use and complaint. Candles stood along the centre, some in simple clay holders, others wedged safely into holes drilled in bits of woods. Their light painted the walls in wavering gold, softening hard lines and deepening shadows. At one end of the table, near the hearth, stood the largest of the loaves that had survived Ragnar's first test as assistant baker. Its crust was proud and only a little uneven. Beside it, on a wooden tray, lay the special bread Matthias had requested for the Mass, marked with a small cross scored into its top. Near them, someone had placed a carved bowl containing a scattering of grain, a nod to the older offerings. A small carved figure of a boar stood watch over it, its wooden snout gleaming with a bit of oil. People filed in slowly, filling the benches, the smell of stew and baked bread wrapped around them, full of herbs and hope. The boar meat, carefully cooked and sliced thin, waited in covered dishes, its scent drifting through the room like a promise. Arn and the older children had been given the solemn duty of cup supervision. They moved along the table with jugs of watered ale and bowls of plain water, eyes narrowed like guardians of some sacred river. "Remember," Arn murmured to Cole, "if anyone starts telling the same story for the fourth time with new details, their cup gets more water and less ale." "That is cruel," Cole said. "It is kind to everyone else," Arn replied. At the far end of the room near the baskets of gifts, Ingrid and Thomas were arranging small parcels and tokens. The offerings for the old gods had already been taken aside earlier to be burned or buried with the proper words. What remained here were small packages for people, mittens, carved toys, bits of cloth, a polished stone or two. Not much, perhaps, to an outside eye. To those who had given them, they were pieces of comfort. When everyone was seated, or as seated as they could be, Torgrim stood again, leaning on his staff. "We come to the table with the storm at our backs and the long night before us," he said. "We have less food than greed would like and more than despair feared. That is a good place to be." He spoke the brief Yule blessing, thanking the old gods and the land itself for what they still had. His words wove through the air like smoke, rising above the clatter and the rustet. When he finished, Matthias took the special loaf and lifted it. The room quieted without being asked. "This bread," Matthias said, "has been made with care, from grain kept through a hard season. We remember the child whose birth we celebrate, born in a place not much finer than this, whose parents worried about him the way we worried last night. We remember that he taught people to share what they had, even when it was not much. He asked a blessing in his own words, simple and direct. Then he broke the loaf, the crust cracking with a satisfying sound. He handed pieces to those nearest him, who in turn passed them down the line. As Eirik took a piece, he realized something. The bread, as it moved along the table, did not care which words had been said over it first. It cared that it was feeding hungry people. He took a bite. It tasted of flour, smoke, and effort. The holy part, he decided, was not in the recipe. The feast rolled into motion. Stew was ladled, meat slices distributed with careful fairness. Children warned gently about trying to sneak extra before everyone had been served. The noise level crept up as bellies filled and shoulders loosened. Ragnar sat between her parents, watching everything with bright eyes. When the plates of meat reached her, she took a small slice and looked at it thoughtfully. "Thank you," she whispered, not entirely sure if she was talking to the boar, the cooks, or whoever had decided the animal would stay in its pen rather than parading through the snow. Arn, across the table, shared his carved pendants. He had made a few with symbols that could be read both ways, cross or intersecting lines, depending on how one tilted them. He gave quietly to the recovered boy, who touched it with cautious fingers. "It will not cure your fever," Arn said, "but it can remind you that you have beaten one." The boy nodded solemnly. That seemed like a fair promise. At some point, someone began a song. At first it was one of the old Yule songs, about fire in the dark and the turning of the year. Voices joined in, rough and out of tune but enthusiastic. Then Matthias, perhaps without thinking too hard, added a verse from a Christmas hymn, its words about light and darkness fitting neatly into the same melody. No one objected. A few hesitated over the unfamiliar parts, then followed as best they could. The song became something new, stitched together from two traditions, neither perfect, both sincere. Eirik leaned back slightly, chewing slowly, listening. He felt a knot inside him loosing. This was never going to be a clean, carefully arranged joining of worlds. It was going to be messy, like this song, like this feast. But it was happening, and the ceiling had not fallen in. By the time the last bowls were scraped and the final stubborn slice of bread claimed, the room hummed with a full, sleepy warmth. Children dozed against parents' sides. Some of the elders leaned their heads back, mouths slightly open, pretending not to nap. The fire burned low but strong. Solveig sat for the first time in what felt like several years. She cradled her cup and looked around the room with the expression of a commander whose battle had gone better than expected, but who still did not trust the peace. "You did it," Eirik said quietly. She snorted softly. "We did it," she corrected. "I merely forced you all into a place and threatened you with brooms." "That is half the work of peace," he replied. "The other half is food, which you also did." She let herself lean against him, just a little. Her lists for once were not within reach. They could wait. Across the room, Matthias and Torgrim sat near each other without speaking much. Their faces were tired, but the lines of tension between them had eased. At some point, the priest said something that made Torgrim huff a laugh. It was not a loud sound, but in its own way it was as clear as any treaty. Eirik watched them for a while, then looked at his own children. Arnd and Ragnar were talking quietly, heads close, hands moving as they described something. Perhaps a plan for the next day, perhaps a retelling of some part of the stories they had heard. He tried his old habit of listing problems. The grain stores were thinner now. The woodpile had shrunk. There were still loose beams on the far house, and a leak in the north corner of his own roof. The ship hull by the fjord still sat under its cover of snow, timbers unfinished, waiting for hands and weather. But beside each worry he found a matching answer. They had more helping hands than before. The village had relearned that it could gather in a crisis and not collapse. The children had seen adults argue and then share work. A boy who had been at the edge of leaving them now slept, wrapped in blankets and breath. For once the problems did not feel like a list of doom. They felt like a set of chores. Big ones, yes, hard ones, but chores all the same. And chores he knew how to handle. As the feast wound down, people began to drift toward the door, slower and heavier than they had entered. Some lingered to help clear the table. Others took on the noble duty of removing empty bowls and pretending that counted as work. Arn and a few others gathered near the baskets of gifts, distributing the small parcels with the seriousness of officials performing a ceremony. When they reached the family from the far farm, Arne handed the recovered boy a small carved animal along with the pendant. "A goat," the boy said, delighted. "So you will never forget that even goats can be repaired when broken," Arne replied. The boy nodded fiercely, clutching it to his chest. At last the longhouse emptied to its usual number of occupants. The quiet that settled afterward felt deep and earned. Eirik sat by the fire, the candlelight flickering over his face, and let himself count to last time. The roof still stood, the walls had not cracked, the Yule goat costume had not caught on fire, a possibility he had quietly worried about. Noah had fallen into the stew, no divine wrath had manifested, unless Ott counted the moment a child knocked over a candle and 5 adults leaped for it like panicked cats. He took a slow breath and let it out. This, he thought, is as close to peace as winter allows. Ragnar curled against his side, half asleep already. Arne stretched out on the bench opposite, hands folded over his chest, pendant resting unseen under his tunic. Solveig poked the fire, revergist fams, the embers shifting into a comfortable glow. Outside, the snow reflected the faint starlight. Inside, the last of the feast's warmth lingered. Eirik closed his eyes, ears filled with the small sounds of his family settling. For the first time in many days, his last thought before sleep was not a worry but a simple statement, quiet and stunned. We are still here. Chapter 10. The Long Light to Come. The days after the feast did not arrive with trumpets or angels or wise men bearing gifts. They arrived with the usual combination of cold air, stiff joints, and the realization that chores, unlike miracles, did not give people much time to bask. Snow still lay thick around the village, though the sharp edges of the storm had softened. Paths had been beaten into the drifts, connecting house to barn, barn to boar pen. The goat costume lurked in its corner, resting between performances with a dignity that straw rarely achieved. Life resumed its rhythm, not entirely as before, but close enough that one could pretend nothing major had happened if one tried very hard and ignored the new shapes in people's thoughts. On a grey morning a few days after the feast, Eirik stood outside his longhouse, axe in hand, staring at the woodpile with a look of wary respect. The pile stared back, unimpressed. "You again?" he muttered. He set to work, the steady rhythm of splitting and stacking easing something in him. The physical effort pushed thoughts into the background, like logs moved to make room for more. As he worked, he heard fragments of conversation drifting across the open space from neighbours. "We will go to Torgrim's house for the Yule stories again next year," a woman was saying. "The children would riot if they could not hear about the storm god and the trickster who fell through the roof." "And we will ask Matthias to hold his mass again," another voice answered. "My old aunt has not stopped talking about that bread." "Both men, both feasts," someone else said. "Twice the chance for food." The laughter that followed sounded easy, no longer forced. In another direction, a group of children played at being both Yule goat and angel. One would knock on a door and demand to know if the household had been good. Another would pretend to be startled, then offer a piece of imaginary bread. A third would twirl around and announce a new star in the sky before falling dramatically into a snowbank. Eirik watched them for a moment, amused. The stories had already begun to tangle in their games. He suspected future priests and goddesses would find this infuriating. He found it oddly comforting. Arne came striding up the path, cheeks flushed, breath steaming. He had been at Matthias's small shelter, helping the priest move his few books to a slightly less drafty corner. "He says he will stay through winter," Arne reported, coming to lean on the woodpile, "at least until he can travel safely back to Nidaros. The bishop wants news of how we welcomed Christmas." Eirik swung the axe, split a log, and set the halves aside before answering. "And how did we welcome it, in your opinion?" he asked. With caution, Arne said. "And bread, and a small amount of panic, but also with kindness." He glanced back toward the priest's lodging. "I asked him if he will come back next year," he added. "What did he say?" Eirik asked. "He said that is up to the bishop and the roads and whether this village still wants him," Arne replied, "and that if he does, he will bring thicker boots." Eirik grunted. "A wise man. The boots, I mean." Arne hesitated, then said, "I have decided something." This sounded serious enough that Eirik paused in his work, resting the axe head on the block. "Go on," he said. "I want to keep learning from Matthias," Arne said. "About his stories, his book words, the way he reads that strange language. I want to see Nidaros again and understand more of what they are building. But I also want to keep carving the old signs, the runes, the dragon heads. I do not want to choose only one set of stories yet." Eirik considered his son's face, the mixture of eagerness and worry there. The world often demanded clear choices, but this winter had shown him those choices were not always as simple as people like to pretend. "You are not a door that must be closed on one side to open on the other," he said. "You are a bridge. Bridges hold weight from both directions. It is uncomfortable, but useful." Arne frowned. Bridges also get walked on. "Yes," Eirik said. "That will happen." Arne smiled reluctantly. "Then I suppose I should at least make sure I am a sturdy bridge." He reached under his tunic and touched the pendant at his chest, feeling the carved lines under his fingers. "Matthias says God can handle questions," he said. Torgrim says the old gods have heard worse than my doubt. I think as long as I keep asking with respect, the world will not break. Eirik nodded. Just remember to keep asking the questions that lead you to chop wood and mend roofs, he said. Theology is important, but ribs and rafters are the things that complain the loudest when ignored. Arn laughed and picked up a log to stack. Ragnar appeared then, carrying a handful of short sticks, each carved with simple shapes. Story sticks, she announced. People like them at the feast, so I am making more. Torgrim says I can hand them out at the Yule stories, and Matthias says he can use them when he tells tales about his saints, if he is polite about borrowing. Eirik took one of the sticks and examined it. Tiny lines and curves marked its length. Some were symbols he recognized. Others seemed to be secret codes known only to his daughter. Do you remember which mark means which story? He asked. She nodded firmly. This sun is the night of the storm, when everyone slept here and the baby did not cry, she said, pointing to a jagged line. This sun is the fever that left. This sun is the first bread we did not burn. She tapped another mark near the end. And this is the day you almost admitted you were proud of us, she added. Eirik blinked. That is a lot to fit on one stick. Stories are small until you tell them, Ragnar said. Then they grow. Arn peered at another stick. What is this mark? He asked. That, Ragnar said with satisfaction, is for the future. It means whatever we have not done yet. Eirik felt a small twist in his chest at that. The future, represented by a simple little shape on a piece of wood, felt both fragile and incredibly solid. Keep those safe, he told her. Someone will want them when we are old. We are not old, she said. Not yet, he agreed, but winter is patient. That evening, after the day's work had whittled down into aches and the house had settled into its usual sounds, Eirik and Solveig found a rare quiet moment by the hearth. The children were pretending to be asleep in the back corner, which meant they were listening with every part of their bodies. Eirik pretended not to notice. It was a game they all enjoyed. Solveig stretched her legs out toward the fire and sighed. I am tired in places I did not know I had places, she said. Eirik smiled. That is what happens when you hold up half the village with your lists, he said. The other half resting on my beams, of course. She gave him a sideways look. Do you regret any of it? She asked. He thought about the past days. The storm, the crowded house, the fever, the shared blessings, the feast that had nearly overbalanced the table, the sight of Torgrim and Matthias standing side by side, the sound of his children laughing after being certain someone might not wake. No, he said, I regret only that the storm did not also finish the ship for me. She snorted. Do not ask the gods for carpentry, she said. They will demand a temple in return. Her gaze softened. Truly though, she said, we changed something, or something changed around us. Do you think we did it well? We did it as well as tired people with limited grain and too many opinions could, he said, which is to say, not perfectly, but not badly. The village is still talking to itself. That is more than many places can say. She nodded slowly. When Matthias first arrived, I thought I would have to choose between the old ways of my parents and whatever the king insists on, she admitted. I thought if I went in, the other would vanish. But now I see that people are more stubborn than stories, and stories are more flexible than people, Eirik added. They bend better. The children will mix them no matter what we decide. Solveig smiled, eyes drifting toward the corner where Arn and Ragnar lay. Arne's hand rested on his chest, where the hidden pendant lay. Ragnar's fingers curled around one of her story sticks, even in sleep. What do you want for them? She asked quietly. In all this? He watched the fire for a moment before answering. I want them to have roofs that do not leak and neighbours who do not turn away in storms, he said. I want them to be able to tell their children that they did not let fear make them cruel. If they can also name all the gods correctly, that will be a pleasant surprise, but not essential. She laughed softly. You have become a philosopher, she said. I have become a man who is too old for comfortable certainty, he replied. Young men are sure of everything. Older men are sure only of the need for warm boots. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the pop and hiss of the fire. "Do you remember when we were young and thought the biggest questions were whether we would have enough fish to trade and whether your father would approve of our marriage?" Solveig said. "I remember," Eirik answered. He paused. "I think my father would be proud of how you handled this winter." She blinked, surprised. "And you?" she asked. He gave a slight shrug. "My opinion does not matter," he said. Then he added quietly, "Of course I am proud, but if I say it too loudly the house might think it has won." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "For what it is worth," she said, "I am proud of you too, for listening to everyone and not hitting anyone with a beam, even when they deserved it." He grinned. "It was a close thing with that elder and the stool," he said. The children, pretending not to listen, smiled into their blankets. A few days later, when the sky had settled into a lighter shade of grey, and the air had a hint, just a hint, of gentler cold, Eirik went back to the ship. It lay by the fjord shore, still half buried in snow, its tarred cover sagging slightly under the weight. The ice near the waterline creaked softly, annoyed by the intrusion of sunlight. Eirik stood for a moment, looking at the hull. The last time he had focused on it, his toes had been too numb and his worries too loud to imagine anything beyond the next cut of the axe. Now, even though winter still gripped the land, the idea of future water felt a little less like fantasy. He brushed snow from the cover, hands moving in practiced sweeps. The curve of the hull emerged, dark and patient. "You again," he told it. "Sorry for leaving you half-dressed during all the drama." The ship did not respond, which was just as well. He was not sure he could handle a sarcastic boat on top of everything else. He pulled back a portion of the cover and ran his hand along the wood. It was cold but solid. The lines were good. The work he had done before all the storms and priests and feasts still held. It reassured him more than he had expected. The world might shift in its stories, but the way a hull curved to cut through water did not change. Footsteps crunched in the snow behind him. He turned to see Matthias picking his way carefully down the path, cloak fluttering around his thin frame. "I am beginning to suspect," Matthias said when he reached him, "that your fjord has a personal grudge against my balance." "It dislikes men from the city," Eirik said. "It finds them entertaining and does not wish them to leave." Matthias smiled and looked at the ship. "She is beautiful," he said, "even in this state." "It will sail in summer. If the gods, the king, the snow, and my joints all agree," Eirik replied. "Perhaps not the first summer, but one of them." Matthias ran his fingers lightly over the hull, respectful as them might touch the wall of a church. "I used to think," he said, "that stone was the only way to make something last. Churches, monuments, altars. But boats leave and return. They carry people and stories between places. That is another kind of lasting." "Stone remembers one place," Eirik said. "Wood remembers the journey." Matthias nodded. "After this winter," he said, "I suspect God cares more about the journeys than the buildings." They stood in silence, listening to the faint sounds of the ice and the distant calls of someone shouting at a stubborn goat that did not wish to be moved. The village behind them hummed with low activity, smoke rising in thin lines. "I will have to go back in time," Matthias said finally. "To Nidaros. To report, to receive new instructions, to argue with men who do not understand snow." Eirik grunted. "They will ask if we have stopped lighting the Yule log," he said. "Yes," Matthias replied. "They will also ask if anyone has smashed the carved idols yet." "Are you going to tell them anyone has?" Eirik asked. Matthias smiled, a small tired smile. "I will tell them," he said, "that the people here listened, that they welcomed Christmas with caution but without violence, that they allowed a priest to pray in their house and did not throw him into a snowbank on purpose, that they care deeply for one another, and that they are stubborn." Eirik nodded. "Stubborn is accurate." "I will also tell them," Matthias added, "that whatever God is doing in this place, he seems to be making people kinder rather than crueler. If the bishop wishes to argue with that, he will have to do so with someone else. I have seen too much to pretend otherwise." Eirik looked at him with some surprise. "You speak boldly for a man who fell into a snowbank on arrival," he said. "Suffering builds character," Matthias replied gravely, "or so the older priests like to claim when someone else is doing the suffering." He glanced toward the village. "May I ask you something?" he said. "As long as it does not require me to attend a second mass this week," Eirik answered. "If I return next year," Matthias said, "will there still be a place by your hearth?" Eirik thought of Torgrim's late-night visit, of his promise, of the warmth of his crowded house during the storm. "If you return in peace and with thick boots," he said, "there will be a place. We cannot guarantee the roof will not complain during your prayers, but at least it will complain over your head and not on it." Matthias gave a small bow of the head. "Then I will try," he said, "to return, and to bring better boots." They stood together a moment longer, two men on the edge of water and winter, connected by a shared season that had been neither entirely Yule nor entirely Christmas, but something in between. When Matthias climbed back up the path, Eirik turned to the ship again. He picked up his tools and set to work, shaping wood with slow, patient strokes. The sound of the axe echoed off the snow, a measured thud that matched the beating of his thoughts. He thought of Torgrim, who had bent enough to let the village move forward without breaking. He thought of Solveig, who had wrestled chaos into rows on a plank. He thought of Arn and Ragnar, carrying pendants and story sticks, bridges and maps in small hands. He thought of the long light to come. Winter would hold on for many more weeks. It always did. There would be more storms, more fevers, more arguments about gods and kings. There would be broken tools, lost mittens, and bread that occasionally burned anyway. But the sun would return by small, stubborn steps. Each day would carry a little more light than the last, so tiny an increase that only those who paid attention would notice at first. Eirik planned to pay attention. As the day wore on, the shadow of the unfinished hull shifted slightly on the snow. The light found new angles on its beams, highlighting the promise of water and travel hidden in the frozen wood. When he finally put down his tools and covered the ship again for the night, Eirik straightened slowly and looked back toward the village. Smoke rose from the longhouses. The sound of laughter drifted faintly, carried by the cold air. Somewhere, Torgrim was probably rehearsing his stories, and Matthias was likely trying to repair a stool again. Solveig would be making a new list for the coming days. Arn would be carving, Ragnar marking another symbol on a story stick. The world had not become simpler, but it had become, in a quiet way, kinder. Eirik took a last breath of the sharp air, then turned toward home, boots crunching on the packed snow. Inside, the hearth would be waiting, the same circle of warmth and light that had held through storms, sickness, and new prayers. Whatever the gods decided among themselves, that fire was his duty. Keep it burning, he thought. Keep the doors open. Teach the children not to fear every change and not to trust every promise. That is our work. The long light was coming, slow and sure. When it arrived, it would find a village that had learned, in Nadhard winter, how to hold more than one story in its hands without dropping either. Eirik smiled to himself, a small, private expression, and stepped through his own doorway as the sky dimmed. The house welcomed him with heat, with the sound of voices, with the smell of stew. The roof creaked its usual complaint, which he found more comforting than silence. He closed the door gently behind him, shutting out the cold and gathering the winter in one more time.